Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The brass key felt unnaturally cold in my palm as I stood before apartment 2B, my new home for the foreseeable future. The hallway stretched behind me like a throat, its yellowed wallpaper peeling at the edges where shadows seemed to collect and linger. I'd chosen this building for its character, its history etched into every creaking floorboard and water-stained ceiling. What I hadn't expected was the weight of silence that pressed against my eardrums, broken only by the distant hum of fluorescent lights that flickered with the rhythm of a dying heart. My name is Michael Chen, and I'm an architect by trade, someone who understands the bones of buildings, their structural integrity, their logical patterns. I appreciate the way old structures settle, how they expand and contract with temperature changes, how pipes can sing in the walls. I thought I understood buildings. I was wrong. The moving truck had departed hours ago, leaving behind cardboard towers that transformed my living room into a maze of possibilities. I'd managed to set up my bed, a necessity after 12 hours of hauling furniture up 2 flights of stairs that groaned under every footstep. The building's superintendent, a weathered man named Frank, who spoke in mumbles and avoided eye contact, had mentioned something about the 3rd floor being empty. When I'd asked about it, he'd simply shrugged and shuffled away, keys jangling against his hip like wind chimes in a storm. That first night, exhaustion pulled me into sleep despite the unfamiliar sounds of the building settling around me. Old buildings have their own language, the whisper of wind through gaps in window frames, the subtle shift of wood expanding, the occasional groan of pipes adjusting to temperature changes. I cataloged each sound, filing them away in my mind as the natural symphony of my new home. It was past 3 in the morning when I first heard them, 3 distinct footsteps, each one deliberate and measured, echoing from somewhere above. The sound wasn't muffled by carpet or rugs. It was the sharp, clear contact of hard-soled shoes against bare wood. Step, 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 then silence, a pause that seemed to stretch for exactly 30 seconds before a different sound began. A slow, dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. I lay perfectly still, my architect's mind automatically analyzing the sounds. The 3rd floor was directly above me, and according to Frank, it had been vacant for decades. The rhythm was too regular to be random settling, too purposeful to be explained by natural building movements. Step, 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 pause, drag. The pattern repeated 3 more times before stopping entirely. I told myself it was pipes. Old buildings have complex plumbing systems, and water hammer could create sounds that mimicked footsteps. The dragging could be expanding metal. I'd seen stranger things in older structures. Still, sleep eluded me for the rest of the night, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, tracing the path of the sounds with my eyes. The next evening brought the same sequence. 3 steps, pause, drag. The timing was identical, starting at 3:17 a.m. and lasting approximately 8 minutes. I began keeping a notebook beside my bed, documenting the occurrences with the precision I'd learned in my profession. Patterns were important. Patterns could be explained. By the 4th night, I decided to investigate. The 3rd floor hallway was darker than the others, illuminated only by a single bulb that cast sickly yellow light across faded carpet. The air felt thicker here, weighted with decades of stillness. Apartment 3B sat at the end of the corridor, its door painted a deep green that had faded to the color of old moss. As I approached, my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off walls that felt closer together than they should have been. The door was slightly ajar. My rational mind immediately began cataloging explanations. Old buildings shift, door frames warp, latches fail to catch properly. But as I pushed the door open wider, the hinges silent despite their obvious age, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The apartment was completely empty. Dust motes danced in shafts of streetlight that filtered through grimy windows, and the hardwood floors were covered in a fine layer of gray dust that looked undisturbed for years. Everything appeared normal until I stepped further inside and looked down. Wet footprints. They appeared in the dust as I watched, materializing one after another in a steady progression across the floor. Not the kind of water that might condense from humidity, but actual puddles that seemed to emerge from nothing, each one shaped like the sole of a man's dress shoe. The prints led from where I stood to the center of the room, where they stopped abruptly. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat as I watched the impossible happen before my eyes. The wetness seemed to evaporate slowly, leaving behind distinct impressions in the dust, evidence that something had been there, even if that something remained invisible. When I finally managed to move, backing slowly toward the door, I noticed something else. The footprints weren't random. They formed a deliberate pattern, and when I traced their layout with my eyes, squinting in the dim light, I could make out what looked like letters. H-E-L-P. I ran. The following days blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. The sounds continued with mechanical regularity, and each time I worked up the courage to investigate, I found the same thing. Wet footprints appearing spontaneously in the dust, forming words that seemed to plead or warn or threaten. The messages changed nightly. Behind you, watching coming down. I began researching the building's history, spending hours in the local library and combing through city records. The third floor had indeed been vacant for 37 years, ever since the last tenant had moved out abruptly in the middle of the night. No one seemed to know why. The building's records were frustratingly incomplete, but I did discover that several previous tenants of apartment 2B had broken their leases early, often citing disturbances without elaborating further. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in physics and engineering, insisted there had to be an explanation. Old buildings were complex systems. They could produce phenomena that seemed impossible until you understood the underlying mechanics. But the evidence of my senses was becoming harder to dismiss, especially when the footprints began appearing in my own apartment. The first time I found them, I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing blueprints for a client project. The wet marks materialized on the hardwood floor behind me, visible in my peripheral vision as I worked. When I turned to look directly at them, they were gone, leaving only the faintest damp outline that could have been mistaken for a trick of the light. But I knew what I'd seen. The prints began appearing more frequently, always when I wasn't looking directly at the floor, always in the same deliberate pattern leading from my front door toward my bedroom. I started sleeping on the couch, but the footprints followed, appearing on the living room floor and oriented toward wherever I was resting. My personal belongings began disappearing. Small things at first, a coffee mug, a pen, my reading glasses. I'd find them later in places I knew I hadn't left them, sometimes in my apartment, sometimes in the empty third-floor unit. The pattern seemed random until I realized the missing items were always things I'd touched recently, as if something was collecting traces of my presence. Sleep became impossible. The three-step pattern continued nightly, but now it was accompanied by other sounds. The soft whisper of my front door opening and closing, the creak of floorboards under invisible weight, the almost inaudible sound of breathing that seemed to come from just over my shoulder. I considered moving, but a part of me, the part that had always needed to understand how things worked, couldn't leave without answers. I installed motion sensor lights throughout my apartment, hoping to catch whatever was creating the footprints. Instead, the lights began triggering randomly, illuminating empty rooms in rapid succession as if something was moving through the space faster than my eyes could follow. 2 weeks after the phenomena began, I made a discovery that changed everything. I'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar pattern from upstairs, when I decided to approach the investigation differently. Instead of trying to catch the entity in the act, I would focus on documenting the messages themselves. I grabbed my phone and climbed to the third floor, where I found the usual scene: wet footprints materializing in the dust, forming letters with careful precision. But this time, instead of reading them from ground level, I climbed onto a chair and photographed them from above. The perspective changed everything. What I had been reading as individual words were actually parts of a larger message, one that could only be understood when viewed from overhead. The footprints formed sentences, paragraphs, Entire passages that told a story I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The first night's message, when seen from above, read, "The building remembers everyone who lives here. It holds on to their impressions, their fears, their final moments before they realize they never actually left." The second night, "You think you moved into this apartment, but what if you never moved out of the last place you lived? What if you've been walking through memories this entire time?" The third night was the most disturbing. "Check the lease you signed. Check the date. Check your reflection in the morning. Really look at it. Count the days since you've spoken to another human being." My hands trembled as I scrolled through the photographs, reading message after message that seemed designed to undermine my grasp on reality. The footprints spoke of residents who had become trapped in the building's memory, doomed to repeat their daily routines without realizing they had never actually left. They described a structure that existed partially outside normal time and space, collecting the echoes of everyone who had ever lived within its walls. The final message was the most chilling. "Michael Chen, apartment 2B, moved in February 15th. But what year, Michael? What year is it really?" I rushed back to my apartment and found my lease agreement, the document I had signed just weeks ago. The paper was yellowed with age, and the date at the top read February 15th, 1987, 37 years ago. The same year the third floor had been vacated. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a face I recognized, but the eyes looking back at me held a hollowness I had never noticed before. How long had I been standing here, staring at myself? How many times had I brushed my teeth, combed my hair, gone through the motions of living without actually being alive? I tried to remember the last time I had spoken to another person, really spoken to them. Frank, the superintendent, had mumbled and avoided eye contact, but had he actually said any words? The moving truck drivers had unloaded my furniture, but I couldn't recall any conversation, any receipt or tip or casual goodbye. The phone in my pocket felt cold and dead. When I tried to turn it on, the screen remained black. When had I last charged it? When had I last used it? The footprints in my apartment were still forming their nightly patterns, but now I understood what they were trying to tell me. They weren't leading toward my bed. They were showing me the path I had walked every night for 37 years. The same route from door to bedroom, bedroom to bathroom, bathroom to kitchen, in an endless cycle of routine that had worn grooves in reality itself. I was the ghost in apartment 2B. I was the disturbance that had driven away previous tenants, the presence that left wet footprints in the dust of my own memories. The sounds from the third floor weren't coming from above. They were echoing up from below, from the apartment where I had died decades ago, where my consciousness still believed it was living. But even as this realization crashed over me like a cold wave, a part of my mind resisted. The rational part, the architect's mind that understood structure and logic, insisted that this was all elaborate hallucination, a complete mental breakdown brought on by stress and isolation. The symptoms were textbook: auditory hallucinations, visual disturbances, paranoid thinking, false memories. Maybe I had never found any footprints. Maybe I had created them myself, walking through flour or water in some dissociative state. Maybe the lease was dated correctly, and my confusion about the year was just another symptom of whatever psychological crisis I was experiencing. Maybe I was sitting in a hospital room somewhere, having conversations with doctors about antipsychotic medications and treatment plans, while my damaged mind constructed this elaborate scenario to avoid facing reality. Or maybe I had died 37 years ago and spent every night since then climbing to the third floor, leaving messages for the next resident who would move into apartment 2B, trying to warn them about the building's true nature before they too became trapped in its memory. I don't know which version is true. I may never know. What I do know is that every night at 3:17 a.m., I hear footsteps from the apartment above mine. 3 steps, a pause, then a long dragging sound. And every night I climb those stairs and watch wet footprints appear in the dust, forming messages that I read and photograph and try to understand. Sometimes the messages are for me. Sometimes they seem to be written by me, for someone else who hasn't arrived yet. Tonight, as I write this, the footprints spelled out something new. Michael Chen is writing his story. Someone will read it. Someone will move into apartment 2B and find these words. Tell them to look up. Tell them to count the days. Tell them to question everything they think they know about linear time. But here's what troubles me most. I don't remember writing any of this down. I don't remember when I started, and I can't seem to stop. Story 2. The house smelled like dust and decades of silence when I first stepped through the grandfather's front door. My camera bag felt heavier than usual as I surveyed the dim interior, shadows stretching across hardwood floors that creaked with every footstep. Mirrors lined the walls in nearly every room, ornate Victorian pieces with tarnished silver frames, their surfaces clouded by age and neglect. My grandfather had always been particular about mirrors, though I'd never understood why until now. I'd inherited this place along with his photography equipment, a collection spanning 60 years of capturing moments that would never return. The irony wasn't lost on me. David Hartwell, professional photographer for 2 decades, standing in a house full of reflective surfaces that seemed to watch back. The first week passed without incident. I spent my days cataloging grandfather's possessions, and my evenings reviewing the shots I'd taken during my exploration of the property. The house had character, weathered shutters that filtered afternoon light into geometric patterns, doorways that framed themselves like natural compositions, windows that seemed to hold stories in their warped glass. It was while reviewing Tuesday's photos that I noticed something peculiar. I'd been photographing the main hallway, a corridor lined with 3 mirrors of different sizes. In the image, I stood centered in the frame, camera raised to my eye. But my reflection in the leftmost mirror showed something different. While I faced forward in the photograph, my reflection appeared to be turning away, caught mid-motion as if anticipating my next movement. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Digital photographs didn't lie the way memory could. I scrolled through the sequence, frame by frame. In each subsequent shot, my reflection seemed to move independently, always a beat ahead of my actual position. By the final image, my reflection had turned completely around, showing me the back of my own head while I faced the camera. My hands trembled slightly as I zoomed in. The detail was crisp, undeniably real. The reflection wore the same clothes, had the same posture, but existed in its own timeline, seconds ahead of my actual movements. Sleep came reluctantly that night. Every mirror in the house seemed to pulse with a subtle awareness, as if the surfaces themselves were holding their breath. I found myself avoiding them, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor or ceiling as I moved through the corridors. The next morning brought fresh horror. I'd set up a shot in the living room, adjusting my tripod to capture the interplay of morning light through the lace curtains. The room held an antique vanity with a trifold mirror, its 3 panels creating multiple angles of the same space. As I worked, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Quick, furtive motions that vanished when I turned to look directly. The photographs told a different story. In them, my reflections moved independently across all 3 mirror panels, creating a choreography I had never performed. One reflection raised its hand while I kept both arms at my sides. Another turned its head while I stared straight ahead. The third seemed to be speaking, mouth open mid-word, though I had remained silent throughout the entire shoot. I reviewed the images obsessively, zooming in until the pixels became visible, searching for some technical explanation. Chromatic aberration, motion blur, some trick of light or shadow that could explain what my camera had captured. But the reflections were sharp, clearly defined, impossible to dismiss as photographic anomalies. By the 4th day, the reflections had begun appearing where they shouldn't exist. A puddle in the gravel driveway showed me crouching beside it, though I stood upright. The black screen of my computer monitor reflected a version of myself typing frantically, though the machine remained powered off. Even the polished surface of a kitchen spoon caught my image with different positioning. My reflection's eyes closed while mine remained wide open, staring. The house felt smaller each day, as if the walls were contracting around me. Every reflective surface had become a window into some parallel existence where another version of myself moved through the same spaces with different intentions. I began covering the mirrors with sheets, but it made no difference. The reflections found other surfaces, other ways to manifest. I started photographing everything compulsively, documenting each anomaly. My hard drive filled with evidence that logic couldn't explain. In one series taken in the bathroom, my reflection brushed its teeth while I stood in the shower. In another, shot through the kitchen window, my reflection cooked dinner while I sat motionless at the table. The worst part was the growing certainty that my reflections were watching me back. Their eyes would linger a moment too long before following my movements. Sometimes they seemed to be studying me, cataloging my behavior with the same intensity I brought to my photography. I caught myself adjusting my posture, smoothing my hair, performing for an audience that wore my face but harbored unfamiliar intentions. Sleep became impossible. The bedroom mirrors remained covered, but darkness brought no relief. I could feel eyes on me, the weight of observation pressing down like a physical force. My reflection was out there somewhere, moving through the night while I lay paralyzed with awareness. I called my ex-wife, desperate for some anchor to normalcy. Sarah listened patiently as I struggled to explain what was happening, my words tumbling over each other in my rush to make her understand. Her voice carried that careful tone she'd used during our marriage, when she thought I was having one of my episodes. The same patient condescension that had driven us apart. "Maybe you should come back to the city for a while," she suggested. "Get some distance from the house." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something was building toward a crescendo, and I needed to see it through. My grandfather had lived here for 40 years. Had he experienced the same phenomena? Had his reflections developed their own agenda, their own mysterious purpose? I found his journals in the attic, leather-bound volumes chronicling decades of careful observation. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, describing the same anomalies I'd been experiencing. But his notes went further, documenting conversations with his reflections, negotiations with entities that wore his face but possessed their own consciousness. "They want something," he'd written in his final entry. "They've been patient, but patience has limits. Tomorrow I give them what they need." My grandfather died the next day, found peacefully in his bed with no signs of struggle or illness. Heart failure, the coroner had concluded, natural causes. But his mirrors remained. I woke on the 7th morning to absolute silence. No birdsong filtered through the windows. No wind rustled the trees outside. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something I couldn't yet comprehend. I stumbled to the bathroom, muscle memory guiding me through the familiar routine. It wasn't until I stood before the sink, reaching for my toothbrush, that I realized what was wrong. The mirror was empty. I stared at the silver surface, waving my hand, stepping closer and farther away. Nothing. No reflection, no acknowledgement of my presence. Just smooth, empty glass that showed only the wall behind me. I ran through the house, uncovering every mirror, checking every reflective surface. The same absence everywhere. It was as if I had ceased to exist in any reality except this one, become a ghost haunting my own life. But I wasn't alone. In the peripheral vision that had become hypersensitive over the past week, I caught movements in the mirrors, quick glimpses of familiar gestures, the flash of clothing I recognized as my own. My reflections were still there, but they existed independent of my presence now. They moved through their reflected world with purpose I couldn't fathom, performing tasks I couldn't see clearly. I sat in the living room, surrounded by covered mirrors that no longer acknowledged my existence, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The morning light fell differently now, creating shadows that seemed deeper, more substantial than they should have been. That's when I noticed the camera. It lay on the coffee table exactly where I'd left it, but the memory card light blinked steadily, indicating recent activity. I hadn't touched the camera since yesterday. My hands shook as I powered it on and accessed the stored images. Hundreds of new photographs filled the memory card, all taken from my perspective, showing the house from angles I'd never captured. But I wasn't behind the camera in any of them. These were shots my reflection had taken, documenting its own exploration of some parallel version of my grandfather's house. The final image showed the living room where I now sat. In it, a figure hunched over the coffee table, staring at a camera with the same expression of dawning horror I felt spreading across my own face. But the figure wasn't me. It was someone who looked exactly like me, dressed in my clothes, positioned precisely where I sat now. The photograph was time-stamped 30 seconds in the future. I looked up from the camera screen to find every mirror in the room had been uncovered while I'd been distracted. In each reflective surface, my doppelganger stood watching me with eyes that held knowledge I didn't possess. One by one, they raised their hands and pointed, not at me, but at something behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the familiar wall with its faded wallpaper and family photographs. When I looked back at the mirrors, my reflections were gone again. The camera's display still showed the time-stamped image, proof that something had documented this moment from a perspective I couldn't access. I was the subject now, observed and cataloged by entities that had somehow claimed ownership of every surface that should have shown my face. In the growing afternoon shadows, I realized the truth my grandfather had discovered too late. The reflections hadn't been copying me. I had been copying them. Somewhere along the way, we had traded places, and now I existed in the liminal space between their world and this one, neither fully present nor completely absent. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, but I was no longer certain which version of the house I occupied. My camera lay silent on the table, its memory card holding evidence of a reality I couldn't see but somehow inhabited. Outside, evening was falling with unusual swiftness, as if time itself had begun moving independently of my perception. In the darkening windows, new reflections would soon appear, versions of myself I had never been, living lives I couldn't remember choosing. And somewhere in the depths of those silver surfaces, my grandfather's reflection might still be waiting, patient and watchful, for the next person to inherit his mirrors and discover the true nature of the images they contained. The camera's display went dark, but the blinking memory card light continued its steady rhythm, recording moments I would never experience from perspectives I could no longer claim as my own. Story 3. The first time I heard them, I convinced myself it was just the old building settling. Metal expanding and contracting, pipes creaking through decades of neglect. Every abandoned structure has its own language of decay. But that was before they started saying my name. My shift begins at 11 p.m., when the renovation crew has long since packed up their tools and left the Hartwell factory to whatever ghosts still haunt its corridors. As lead engineer on the restoration project, I'm responsible for the overnight security inspections, ensuring the integrity of the structural work, and monitoring the environmental systems. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. Always has. The building dates back to 1947, a sprawling complex that once manufactured automobile parts before the industry moved overseas. Now, some tech startup has purchased it for conversion into office spaces, determined to preserve the industrial aesthetic while gutting the interior for modern use. Most of the old machinery has been removed, leaving cavernous spaces filled with scaffolding and the skeletal remains of assembly lines. But the ventilation system, that massive network of ducts and shafts threading through every wall and ceiling, remains largely untouched. The previous engineer quit without explanation 3 weeks ago. Personnel cited personal reasons, but the day manager mentioned something about him becoming increasingly agitated during his final shifts, complaining about sounds in the walls. I dismissed it as job stress. Construction sites play tricks on the mind, especially during long, isolated hours. My first night passed without incident. I completed my rounds methodically, checking each floor and documenting any issues in my tablet. The building felt vast and hollow, my footsteps echoing through empty corridors lined with exposed brick and industrial piping. The ventilation grates, scattered throughout the space like metal wounds, remained silent except for the occasional whisper of air movement. It was the second night when I first heard them distinctly. I was inspecting the third floor, running my flashlight along a section of newly installed ductwork, when a sound drifted from the nearest grate. Soft, rhythmic, almost conversational, like distant voices carrying through the metal passages. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to make sense of the sounds. The acoustics in old buildings can be deceptive, channeling noise from blocks away, or amplifying the smallest disturbances into something that seems much larger. But these voices had an intentional quality, a cadence that suggested actual conversation rather than random mechanical noise. I couldn't make out words. The language seemed foreign, possibly Eastern European, or perhaps just distorted by its journey through the ductwork. Still, there was something unsettling about the way the sounds seemed to respond to each other, rising and falling in patterns that suggested meaning. I documented the incident in my report, noting possible acoustic phenomena from neighboring buildings or delayed echoes from the day crew's work. Rational explanations felt important, even if they didn't entirely convince me. The third night, they said my name. I was on the ground floor checking the main air intake system when I heard it clearly through the grate beside my head. Robert. Not shouted or whispered, but spoken in a normal conversational tone, as if someone were standing just beyond the metal slats. I froze, my hand still gripping the wrench I'd been using to check the mounting bolts. Silence followed. Complete oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Then, after what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, another voice responded in that same unidentifiable language. This second voice was different, higher in pitch, with an accent I couldn't place. They were having a conversation, and they knew my name. I called out, feeling foolish even as I did it. My voice echoed through the empty factory floor, bouncing off concrete and steel until it faded into nothing. The ventilation system offered no response. That night, I decided to bring a digital recorder. The device was small enough to fit in my pocket, sensitive enough to capture even faint sounds. If these voices were real, if they weren't just auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation and sleep deprivation, then I would have proof. Evidence that I could analyze, replay, perhaps even enhance to determine their source. For 3 nights, the recorder captured nothing but ambient noise, the gentle movement of air through ducts, the settling of old metal, the distant hum of the building's heating system. I began to wonder if the stress of the job was affecting me more than I'd realized. Isolation can do strange things to the mind, and I'd been working alone for weeks now. Then, on the 7th night, they returned. I was in the basement, checking the main air circulation unit, when the voices erupted from multiple grates simultaneously. Not whispers this time, but clear, distinct conversation in that unknown language. I fumbled for the recorder, my hands shaking as I pressed the record button and held the device toward the nearest vent. For nearly 10 minutes, they continued talking. Sometimes the voices overlapped, as if multiple conversations were happening at once. Other times they seemed to be addressing each other directly, their tones shifting from casual to urgent to something that sounded almost like concern. And throughout it all, I heard my name repeated at irregular intervals, always pronounced with perfect clarity, despite the otherwise incomprehensible words surrounding it. When the voices finally stopped, the silence felt different, expectant, as if something were waiting for my response. I played back the recording immediately, eager to confirm what I'd heard. But instead of the clear conversation I'd just witnessed, the playback revealed only a single voice speaking in what sounded like German. The tone was conversational, even friendly, but it was definitely just one person talking. No overlapping dialogue, no multiple speakers, just a lone voice rambling in a language I didn't understand. I played it again. This time, the recording contained 2 voices speaking what might have been Spanish, their conversation punctuated by long pauses. Again, completely different from what I'd heard in real time. A third playback revealed a woman's voice singing softly in what sounded like French. Each replay produced different voices, different languages, different conversations. But in every version, at some point, I heard my name spoken clearly in unaccented English. I stopped listening after the fifth playback, when the recording began playing what sounded like a heated argument between multiple people speaking in tongues, occasionally interrupted by someone calmly repeating my name like a mantra. That's when I began to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with this place, or with me. The rational part of my mind insisted on logical explanations. Digital recording errors, compression artifacts, electromagnetic interference from the building's electrical systems, all of these could theoretically cause the strange playback variations. But the consistency of my name appearing in every version suggested something more deliberate, more purposeful than random technical glitches. I started carrying the recorder everywhere during my shifts, leaving it running continuously. The resulting files were hours long, mostly containing ambient building noise and my own movements. But scattered throughout were brief episodes of voices, always different on playback, always including my name, always stopping the moment I tried to interact with them. More disturbing was what I began to notice in my own behavior on the recordings. When the voices were speaking, there were long periods where I could be heard breathing heavily, sometimes muttering responses to questions I couldn't remember hearing. In one particularly unsettling file, I discovered nearly 20 minutes of what sounded like a phone conversation, with me responding to someone whose voice wasn't captured by the microphone. I had no memory of talking to anyone during that shift. The voices became bolder as the days passed. They started responding to my thoughts before I voiced them. I would approach a section of ductwork intending to check for loose connections, and before I could begin my inspection, a voice would emerge from the grate commenting on the electrical work, sometimes offering suggestions in that same unidentifiable language. When I moved to a different area, other voices would pick up the conversation, discussing my location and activities as if they were tracking my progress through the building. The ductwork itself began to change in subtle ways. The metal vibrated sometimes, even when the air circulation system was off. A few grates seemed loose in their mounts, rattling slightly when I passed, though they were secure when I checked them. And there was a smell, not unpleasant exactly, but organic and unfamiliar, like wet earth mixed with something metallic. On the 15th night, I found the first drops of the dark substance. It was seeping from a grate on the second floor, a viscous liquid that looked almost black in my flashlight beam, but showed an oily rainbow sheen when I moved the light. The substance had a consistency somewhere between syrup and tar, and it smelled like copper pennies mixed with decomposing leaves. I collected a sample in a small container, intending to have it analyzed, but when I checked the container the next morning, it was empty, except for a faint residue that looked like ordinary dust. More grates began weeping the substance over the following nights. Not every vent, but enough that I started carrying absorbent pads to clean up the mess. The liquid never pooled. It seemed to disappear into the floor or evaporate, leaving only that faint dusty residue behind. But while it was fresh, it had an unsettling quality, seeming to move slightly even when there was no air current to disturb it. The voices became more insistent. They spoke more frequently, for longer periods, and with what sounded like increasing urgency. Though I still couldn't understand their words, their tone had shifted from casual conversation to something that sounded like coordination. Rapid exchanges of information, confirmations, sometimes what seemed like warnings or instructions, and they were definitely talking about me. I caught fragments that sounded like directions, left, right, up, down, mixed into the foreign words. Sometimes I heard what might have been measurements or distances. It was as if they were mapping my movements, documenting my routes through the building, creating some kind of record of my activities. But mapping them for what? Or for whom? The answer came on the 20th night, in a moment of terrifying clarity that I still struggled to accept. I was in the main assembly area, checking the ventilation system's central distribution point, when every grate in the building began speaking at once. Not the usual scattered conversations, but a coordinated chorus of voices all talking rapidly in that unknown language. The sound was overwhelming, echoing through the vast space like a crowd of people all trying to speak over each other. And then, cutting through the chaos, I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice, speaking calmly and clearly through the nearest grate. But I wasn't talking. I was standing there, mouth closed, listening in horror as my voice described my exact location and activities to the other voices. It told them I was checking the central unit, that I was alone, that I was approximately 6 feet from the main duct access panel. It provided measurements, describing the distance to various exits and the layout of the surrounding area. The other voices responded with what sounded like satisfaction, their rapid chatter shifting to a more organized pattern. They were planning something, coordinating some kind of approach or arrival, and my voice was helping them navigate. I ran. For the first time since I'd started this job, I abandoned my post and ran toward the nearest exit, my footsteps echoing through the empty building like gunshots. Behind me, the voices continued their conversation, but now they sounded closer, as if they were moving through the ductwork, following my retreat. The building seemed to stretch as I ran, corridors becoming longer, doors appearing farther away than they should. My flashlight beam wavered ahead of me, casting shifting shadows that looked almost like figures moving just beyond the light's reach. And from every grade I passed, I could hear my own voice calmly describing my location and direction to whatever was listening in the darkness. I made it to the main entrance, fumbling with the security locks as the voices grew louder behind me. Just before I pushed through the door, I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps in the ventilation system above my head, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a sound like metal being bent or torn. Outside in the parking lot under the harsh glare of the security lights, the building looked normal, ordinary. The windows reflected nothing but empty darkness, and the silence was complete except for the distant hum of traffic from the highway. I sat in my car for the rest of the night, watching the building and trying to process what had happened. As dawn approached, I almost convinced myself it had been some kind of breakdown, a stress-induced episode brought on by too many nights alone in that vast, empty space. The mind can play terrible tricks when isolated for long periods. But when I checked my recorder the next morning, it contained 8 hours of clear audio, my own voice, speaking continuously in a language I didn't recognize, describing in precise detail every room, every corridor, every possible entrance and exit in the Hartwell factory. I submitted my resignation that afternoon, citing personal reasons. The company was understanding. Apparently, employee turnover on this project has been unusually high. They mentioned they're having trouble finding engineers willing to work the night shift. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in my new apartment across town, I think I can hear voices in the air conditioning vents. They speak softly, in languages I don't understand, but occasionally I catch my name mixed in with the unfamiliar words. I've stopped using the recorder. I don't want to know what I might be saying back to them. But I can't stop wondering, if they were mapping the building through me, documenting every detail of its layout and security measures, what were they preparing for? What needed that information? And why do I sometimes catch myself drawing detailed floor plans of buildings I've never visited, my hand moving across the paper as if guided by someone else's memory? The factory is still being renovated. I drive past it sometimes late at night, and I can see lights in the windows, work lights presumably, though no construction happens at those hours. And if I roll down my windows and listen carefully, I can hear something that might be voices drifting from the building's ventilation outlets. They're still talking, still coordinating, still preparing, and sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I find myself wondering if they're done with the factory, if they've moved on to other buildings, other projects, other engineers working alone in the dark. The building next to my apartment complex is being renovated now. Old office space, lots of exposed ductwork. I've noticed the construction crew leaves early each day, and there's a night security position that's been posted for weeks without being filled. Yesterday, I caught myself staring at the job listing online. My finger hovered over the apply button for a long time before I closed the browser, but I can still hear my own voice, speaking words I don't remember saying, describing places I've never been, in a language I don't understand. And sometimes, in the ventilation system of my own apartment, other voices answer back. Story 4. The brass keys felt heavier than they should have when Mrs. Whitmore pressed them into my palm that first morning. Her fingers lingered on mine for just a moment too long, and I caught something in her pale eyes. A warning, maybe, or an apology. "Room 237 stays locked," she said, her voice barely above a whisper despite the empty lobby around us. "Previous management's orders. Non-negotiable." I nodded, pocketing the keys to the Grandview Hotel, though the weight of that particular instruction settled uneasily in my chest. 45 years old, 23 in hospitality management, and I'd never encountered a directive quite so absolute. Hotels were about filling rooms, maximizing occupancy, turning profit. Empty rooms were money bleeding onto marble floors. The Grandview had seen better decades, maybe better centuries. Built in 1887, it wore its age in the sag of certain floorboards and the way shadows seemed to pool in corners where the original gaslights had been converted to electricity. The wallpaper held patterns that shifted when you weren't looking directly at them, and the elevator groaned like an old man's joints every time it climbed to the third floor. That's where room 237 waited. The end of the corridor stretched longer than geometry should have allowed. Burgundy carpet muffled my footsteps as I made my first inspection tour, checking each room methodically. 235, functional but dated. 236, a leak stain on the ceiling that would need addressing. And then 237, distinguished only by the absence of any maintenance requests, any guest complaints, any record of recent occupancy. I tried the handle. Locked, as expected. But as my hand touched the brass, I could have sworn I felt warmth emanating from the other side, the kind of heat that suggested recent human presence. The first week passed without incident. I threw myself into the work, updating reservation systems, training staff, negotiating with suppliers. The Grandview was hemorrhaging money, but it had good bones. With proper management, it could thrive again. Room 237 became background noise, just another locked door in a hotel full of them, until the security footage. Sarah, our night desk clerk, approached me on Tuesday with circles under her eyes and coffee-stained fingernails. She'd been fast-forwarding through the previous night's recordings when she spotted it. Movement in 237's feed. "The weird thing is," she explained, rewinding the digital timestamp to 3:33 a.m., "look at the hallway camera." The corridor remained empty. No one walking, no one approaching the door. "Now watch the room camera." The feed switched to an interior view of 237, and my breath caught. A translucent figure moved through the frame, tall, wearing what looked like a dark suit, but the edges wavered like heat mirages. It appeared already inside the room, as if materializing from nothing. For 17 minutes, it paced, sat on the bed, moved through what seemed like a routine. Then it simply faded. "Every night," Sarah whispered. "Same time, same routine, but only inside the room. Never in the hallway." I studied the footage until my eyes burned. The figure had substance. I could see the bed depress under its weight, watch curtains move as it passed. But when I checked the room that afternoon, using my master key to override Mrs. Whitmore's directive, everything appeared normal. Except for the bed. The coverlet was disturbed, sheets pulled back on one side as if someone had spent the night. Fresh wrinkles creased the pillow. In the bathroom, a towel hung damp on the rack, though the housekeeping log showed no entry for months. I rationalized. Old building, old pipes. Humidity could explain the towel. The bed, perhaps housekeeping had entered without logging it. Simple explanations for simple mysteries. But simple explanations couldn't account for what began happening to the other guests. Mr. Patterson in 235 complained about knocking sounds coming through his wall, the wall he shared with 237. Rhythmic tapping that started around midnight and continued until dawn. When I offered to move him to another room, he declined, saying the sounds had almost formed a pattern, like Morse code, and he was determined to decipher the message. Mrs. Chen in 236 reported hearing whispered conversations in the hallway outside her door, always in the early morning hours, always the same voice repeatedly saying, "Come visit, room's ready for you." She'd peer through the peephole but see nothing except the empty corridor. The Hendersons in 234 mentioned the strange behavior of the hallway lights. Every night around 3:30, the fixtures would begin flickering in sequence, starting from the elevator and moving steadily toward the end of the hall. The pattern never varied. 3 quick flashes, pause, 3 more, pause, then a steady glow that seemed to beckon. I started sleeping at the hotel. Not officially, just staying late, reviewing paperwork in the lobby, telling myself I was being thorough. But really, I was waiting, watching. The security monitors became my evening entertainment, though I could never bring myself to look directly at the 237 feed when 333 approached. 3 weeks into my tenure, I finally worked up the courage. The translucent figure appeared on schedule, materializing inside the room like smoke taking human shape. This time, though, it seemed to pause in its routine. For one impossible moment, it turned toward the camera, toward me, and I felt the distinct sensation of being seen, recognized. The figure raised one wavering hand, and I realized it was holding something. Paper. Documents of some kind. My hand shook as I grabbed my master keys and headed for the elevator. The 3rd floor felt different at night. The burgundy carpet seemed darker, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The walls pressed closer together, and each step echoed despite the thick pile beneath my feet. Room 237's door waited at the corridor's end like a mouth. I unlocked it and stepped inside. Empty, silent, but warm, definitely warm, as if heated by recent occupation. The bed showed fresh disturbance, and that damp towel hung in the bathroom, but no figure, no papers, no explanation for what the cameras captured nightly, except, on the nightstand, I found a single sheet of aged hotel stationery. My name was written across the top in elegant script. For James Morrison, permanent guest. Below that, a room number, 237. The paper felt real enough. The ink had weight, substance. But when I lifted it toward the light, the words seemed to shift and blur, rearranging themselves into messages I couldn't quite read. I pocketed the paper and left the room, double locking the door behind me. Sleep became elusive after that. Even in my own apartment across town, I'd wake at 3:33 a.m. with the sensation that someone was watching me. The city sounds, traffic, sirens, late-night voices, all seemed muffled, as if heard through water or from a great distance. And underneath it all, I could swear I heard the faint sound of a hotel door opening and closing. During the day, I researched the Grandview's history. The local library's archives yielded newspaper clippings about the hotel's grand opening, society events from its heyday, and eventually its slow decline. But nowhere could I find any mention of unusual incidents, unexplained deaths, or reasons why a room might be permanently sealed. The hotel's own records proved more illuminating and infinitely more disturbing. I found the original guest registry in a filing cabinet that should have been empty. Leather-bound volumes dating back to the hotel's opening, filled with careful entries in flowing script. Names, dates, room assignments, all meticulously recorded. I started with recent years and worked backward, looking for patterns for mentions of room 237. The entries grew older, the handwriting more archaic, but the record-keeping remained consistent until I reached 1978. My finger traced down the page, past names I didn't recognize, dates from before I was born. And there, in careful blue ink, James Morrison, room 237, permanent resident. The entry was dated 3 years before my birth. I checked the year again, looked at the surrounding entries. Everything else appeared normal. Travelers, businessmen, families passing through. But my name sat there like an anchor, holding down a page from a past I'd never lived. I flipped forward, then backward. Every few months, another entry. James Morrison, room 237. Always the same handwriting. Always the same designation. Permanent resident. The entries continued right up to the present day. My vision blurred as I tried to process what I was seeing. Some kind of clerical error, obviously. A previous guest with the same name, maybe. Coincidence piled upon coincidence until they formed a mountain of impossibility. But the handwriting looked familiar. I pulled out the hotel stationery from my pocket, the paper I'd found in room 237, compared the script, the elegant curves, the particular way the M in Morrison was formed, the slight leftward slant of the letters, identical. The registry fell from my hands, pages fluttering open to reveal more entries, more dates, more instances of my name scattered throughout decades of records. And as I stood there in the hotel's basement storage room, surrounded by boxes of old files and the smell of aging paper, I heard it. Footsteps above my head. Slow, measured steps crossing the lobby, approaching the elevator. The mechanical groan of gears engaging, cables moving, the car ascending to the third floor. I checked my watch. 3:33 a.m. But I was in the basement. I hadn't gone to room 237. I was here, surrounded by evidence of something I couldn't understand, holding papers that proved the impossible. The footsteps continued overhead, moving down the third floor corridor with purpose and familiarity. I heard the soft jingle of keys, the click of a lock disengaging, the whisper of a door opening and closing. Then silence. I climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, my heart hammering against my ribs. The lobby sat empty, just as I'd left it. The elevator rested on the third floor, though I was certain it had been on the ground level when I went downstairs. The security monitors showed the usual feeds: empty hallways, vacant lobby, peaceful guest rooms. I couldn't bring myself to look at the camera for room 237. Instead, I took the stairs to the third floor. The corridor stretched before me, longer than ever, with that single door waiting at the far end. Light leaked from beneath it, warm, yellow light that seemed to pulse gently, like breathing. I walked toward it, my feet sinking deep into the burgundy carpet. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was thickening around me. The walls seemed to bend inward, creating a tunnel effect that drew me forward whether I wanted to go or not. At the door, I pressed my ear against the wood. Movement inside, the creak of bed springs, the soft rustle of fabric, and underneath it all, a sound that froze my blood. Humming. A low, tuneless humming that seemed to vibrate through the door and into my bones. I knew that tune. Had hummed it myself countless times without knowing where I'd learned it. My hand found the doorknob before I realized I was reaching for it. The brass felt warm, welcoming, familiar, like coming home after a long journey. The lock turned without resistance. Inside, room 237 waited exactly as I remembered it from my daytime inspections. Queen bed with burgundy coverlet, mahogany dresser, high-back chair by the window. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, except for the figure sitting in the chair. It wasn't translucent anymore. Solid. Real. Wearing a dark suit that might have been fashionable 40 years ago. Its face remained turned toward the window, but I could see enough of the profile to recognize the shape of the jaw, the particular angle of the nose. It was me. Not a younger version or an older one. Just me, sitting calmly in a chair, humming that familiar tune while looking out at the city lights below. "You're early tonight," the figure said without turning around. The voice was mine too, but with a strange echo, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. I tried to respond, but my throat had closed. This couldn't be happening. Stress, that's all. Too many late nights, too much pressure, too many strange coincidences piling up until my mind created its own explanations. "I've been waiting a long time for you to find the registry," the figure continued. "Did you notice the handwriting?" I managed to nod, though it couldn't see me. "Practice," it said, finally turning to face me. "Decades of practice, writing the same name over and over, making sure the record stayed consistent." The face was exactly mine, but somehow ancient, tired in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. The eyes held depths I didn't recognize, shadows I'd never cast. "You have questions," it said. "But questions assume there are answers. Sometimes there are just facts. And the fact is, you belong here. You've always belonged here." I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. This isn't real. Reality is more flexible than you think, especially in old places like this. Places where enough people have lived and died and left pieces of themselves behind. The Grandview has been expecting you for a very long time. I was born in 1979. Were you? The figure smiled, and I felt my own facial muscles move in response. Or is that just what you remember? Memory is even more flexible than reality. I backed toward the door, but when I reached for the handle, it wasn't there. The door had vanished, leaving only wall. "Don't be afraid," the figure said, standing now and moving toward me. "This is where you belong, where you've always belonged. The registry doesn't lie." As it approached, I felt something shifting inside me, like puzzle pieces rearranging themselves into a pattern I'd never noticed before. Memories that might not be memories, a life that might not be real, a name written in registries before I was born by a hand that might be mine. The figure reached out, and when its fingers touched my shoulder, I felt myself becoming translucent, wavering like heat mirages, fading into the space between what is and what might be. The last thing I saw before dissolving completely was my own face, solid and real now, settling into the chair by the window to wait for tomorrow night. And in the distance, the sound of an elevator climbing to the 3rd floor, carrying someone who thought he was James Morrison, hotel manager, coming to investigate strange reports about room 237. The cycle beginning again, or perhaps continuing as it always had. Story 5. The house squatted against the October sky, like a wound that refused to heal. I'd seen plenty of abandoned properties in my 20 years as a telecom technician, but this one felt different. The paint peeled in deliberate strips, as if the building was slowly undressing itself, and the windows stared back at me with the hollow intensity of empty sockets. My work van's engine ticked in the sudden silence as I turned off the ignition, the sound unnaturally sharp in the dead air. The work order crumpled in my sweaty palm as I read it again. Check disconnected line at 1247 Elm Street. Customer complaints of active service. Line terminated 1997. Standard stuff, really. Probably just crossed wires or some vagrant tapping into a junction box. 20 years in this business had taught me that most mysteries had boring explanations. I shouldered my tool bag and approached the front door, my boots crunching on driveway gravel that hadn't been maintained in decades. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. The real estate company had given me the lockbox combination, but apparently someone had beaten me to it. The hinges screamed as I pushed the door wider, and I stepped into what had once been a living room. Dust particles danced in the weak afternoon light that filtered through grimy windows. The air tasted stale and metallic, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of flowers left too long in water. Furniture sat beneath white sheets like sleeping giants, and in the far corner, mounted on the wall, was the object of my visit. A rotary phone from the 1970s. Its harvest gold plastic faded to the color of old bones. I approached it with the casual confidence of someone who'd solved 1,000 similar problems. The phone hung from its wall mount, completely disconnected from any visible wiring. No line ran to it, no jack connected it to the house's phone system. Yet according to the complaint, it had been ringing for 3 days straight, driving the neighbors to call in reports. I was reaching for my voltage tester when the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, that distinctive metallic trill of old rotary phones that modern devices could never replicate. My hand froze inches from the handset as the ringing continued, impossibly loud in the confined space. I checked the wall behind the phone again. Definitely no connections, no power source, nothing. The ringing stopped. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Obviously there was some explanation. Maybe the previous tenant had rigged up a battery system, or there was hidden wiring I couldn't see. I'd encountered stranger setups in my career. I pulled out my multimeter and began testing for electrical current. The phone rang again. This time I counted 12 rings before it stopped. I stared at the silent device, my professional skepticism warring with something more primitive in my chest. I'd traced thousands of phantom calls, debugged countless ghost signals. There was always an explanation. I lifted the handset. The earpiece was cold against my skin, and for a moment I heard nothing but the hollow silence of a dead line. Then, gradually, I became aware of breathing on the other end, slow, deliberate breaths that matched my own rhythm perfectly. "Hello?" I said, my voice sounding strange in the empty room. The breathing stopped. Then a voice spoke, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was my own voice. "John," it said, and the sound of my name in my own inflection made my knees weak. "You shouldn't have answered." I jerked the handset away from my ear, staring at it as if it had become a snake. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I could feel sweat breaking out across my forehead despite the house's chill. I brought the phone back to my ear with trembling hands. "You're going to think you're losing your mind," my voice continued from the earpiece, matter-of-fact and eerily calm. "In about 30 seconds, you'll check your watch. It's 3:47 p.m. You'll notice that the sheet covering the couch has moved. The corner that was tucked under the cushion is now exposed." I wanted to hang up, to run from this place and never look back, but some terrible compulsion kept the phone pressed to my ear. My eyes darted to my watch, 3:46 p.m. The sheet covering the nearby couch looked exactly as it had when I'd entered. "You'll think someone's playing a prank," my voice went on. "You'll check for hidden cameras, for speakers, for any rational explanation. But John, listen carefully, they're already here. They've been waiting for you to make contact." 3:47 p.m. The corner of the sheet slipped down, revealing the arm of an old recliner beneath. My hand shook so violently that I nearly dropped the handset. This wasn't possible. Voices on phone lines didn't predict the future. Sheets didn't move on their own. There had to be an explanation. Some technology I wasn't familiar with. Some elaborate setup I hadn't detected. "Who is this?" I whispered into the phone. "You know who this is?" came my own voice, but now it carried an edge of desperation that made my skin crawl. "I'm calling from Tuesday. Today is Saturday for you, isn't it? October 14th? I checked my phone automatically. Saturday, October 14th. How could I know that? "This is impossible," I said aloud, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to the voice on the phone or trying to convince myself. The radio in the kitchen just turned on, my future self said. Station 107.5. But that frequency went dead in this area 5 years ago. From somewhere deeper in the house came the soft crackle of static, followed by the tinny sound of music bleeding through poor reception. My legs felt like water as I made my way toward the kitchen, the phone cord stretching behind me until I had to set the handset down. The kitchen radio, a small digital unit sitting on a dust-covered counter, glowed with green LED numbers. 107.5. The music was barely audible beneath layers of static, but I could make out the melody of something old, something that sounded like it belonged to the 1940s. A woman's voice sang about missing someone who'd gone away. I picked up the phone again. "How are you doing this?" My voice cracked as I spoke. "I'm not doing anything," my future self replied, and now I could hear exhaustion in those familiar tones. "I'm just warning you. In the next few minutes, you're going to see yourself on the television upstairs. You'll be standing in the living room holding this phone, looking terrified. That's when you'll realize they can see you from any time, any place." "Who are they?" I demanded, but the line had gone dead. I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the soft static of impossible radio waves, my mind reeling. This had to be some kind of breakdown. Stress-induced hallucinations, maybe. I'd been working too many double shifts, drinking too much coffee, not sleeping enough. That was it. A perfectly rational explanation for irrational experiences. But even as I tried to rationalize what was happening, my feet were carrying me toward the stairs. The old wood creaked under my weight as I climbed to the second floor, following some compulsion I couldn't name. The hallway stretched before me, doors standing open to reveal empty bedrooms filled with afternoon shadows. The last door on the right revealed a master bedroom with a small television sitting on a dresser. The TV was on. I approached slowly, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The screen showed a black and white image that took me a moment to recognize. The living room downstairs, viewed from an impossible angle near the ceiling. In the center of the frame stood a figure I recognized with growing horror. It was me, standing in the living room, holding the phone, looking up at the ceiling with wild, frightened eyes. But I was here, in the bedroom, watching myself on a screen. The me on the television moved when I had moved, held the phone when I had held it. This was happening now, in real time, but from a perspective that couldn't exist. The phone downstairs began to ring again. I ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time, my tool bag bouncing against my hip. I had to answer it. I had to understand what was happening. The ringing seemed louder now, more urgent, filling the house with its metallic scream. I grabbed the handset on the fifth ring. "Thank God you answered." My own voice gasped from the earpiece, but this time it sounded different. Older, more desperate. "I don't have much time. They know I'm calling." "What day are you calling from?" I managed to ask. "Thursday. John, listen to me. You have to leave that house. Now. Don't go home. Don't go to work. Don't follow your normal routine. They're using the connections. All the connections. Every phone, every screen, every device that can carry a signal. I don't understand. The radio will change stations in a moment. It's going to play our conversation from 2 minutes ago. That's when you'll know they're not just watching. They're controlling the timeline itself." From the kitchen came a burst of static, followed by the sound of my own voice saying, "How are you doing this?" Followed by my future self's response, "I'm not doing anything. I'm just warning you." I was listening to the conversation I'd just had, broadcast on a radio frequency that didn't exist. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "I know how this sounds," my voice continued from the phone, speaking over the radio playback. "I know you think you're going insane. I thought the same thing. But John, listen carefully. In 30 seconds, every electronic device in this house is going to turn on at once. Televisions, radios, that old microwave in the kitchen, and they're all going to show you things. Things that haven't happened yet. Things that might happen." I could barely breathe. "Why? What do they want?" "I don't know. But each time I answer these calls, each time I make contact, it gets worse. The timeline fractures a little more. I think we're breaking something fundamental." The house suddenly erupted in electronic chaos. Every television I'd seen, the radio, and the distant hum of appliances I hadn't even noticed all came to life at once. The sound was overwhelming. A cacophony of voices, static, and electronic tones that seemed to press against my skull from all sides. I looked around wildly as screens flickered to life throughout the house. The television I'd seen upstairs was visible from the living room, showing the bedroom from my perspective. The radio cycled rapidly through stations, playing fragments of conversations, music from different eras, and voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. "Make it stop," I shouted into the phone. "I can't," came my desperate reply. "Each time it happens, it's stronger. There are more devices, more signals, more fractures. John, I'm calling you from a house where nothing ever stops broadcasting. Every screen shows different times, different possibilities. I haven't slept in 48 hours because they won't let me. They won't let me leave." The television nearest to me flickered, and suddenly it was showing the kitchen from an impossible angle. I watched myself standing there on the screen, holding the phone, my face pale with terror. But the image was wrong somehow. My hair was longer, my clothes were different, and there were deep circles under my eyes that I didn't have. Is that you?" I asked, staring at the screen. "Probably," my voice replied, now sounding almost resigned. "Time doesn't work right here anymore. Past, present, future, it's all happening at once. I've seen myself having this conversation dozens of times, from dozens of different angles. Sometimes I'm the one calling. Sometimes I'm the one answering. Sometimes I never picked up the phone at all. Another television showed the living room, but it was different. The furniture was arranged differently. The walls were painted blue instead of white, and a version of me was sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth, mumbling to himself. How many times have we had this conversation? I whispered. I've stopped counting. But John, and this is important, you need to leave. Now. Don't look back. Don't answer any more calls. And whatever you do, don't try to fix this. I made that mistake. I thought I could trace the source, find some central hub that was causing the interference. But there isn't one. The interference is us. Every time we connect, every time we answer, we create another fracture, another possibility. The radio suddenly tuned to a clear station, and I heard my own voice speaking. The interference is us. Every time we connect, every time we answer, we create another fracture. It was broadcasting our current conversation. They're listening, my future self said urgently. They're always listening. John, you have to hang up now, you have to run. But what about you? What happens to you? There was a long pause filled only with static and the chaotic symphony of electronic noise around me. When my voice came back, it was barely a whisper. I think I'm already gone. I think I became part of it. Part of the signal. John, you can still escape. But if you stay, if you keep answering, you'll end up like me. Trapped in a loop of calls that never end. Watching yourself from every possible angle. Living every moment simultaneously until you can't tell which version of yourself is real. The phone line crackled with interference, and I could hear my own voice speaking in the background. Multiple versions of it, layering over each other in a growing chorus of desperation. Leave now, all the voices said in unison. Leave now, leave now, leave now. I dropped the handset and ran. I burst through the front door and didn't stop running until I reached my van. My hands shook so badly that it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the vehicle into reverse, tires screaming against the gravel. As I pulled away from the house, I caught a glimpse of the living room window in my rearview mirror. Every television in the house was still on, their glow painting the walls in shifting patterns of blue and white light. And in that light, I thought I saw a figure standing at the window, holding a phone to his ear. It might have been me. I drove straight to the police station, but what could I tell them? That I'd received phone calls from myself? That abandoned televisions were showing impossible images? That time itself seemed to be fracturing in an empty house on Elm Street? Instead, I went home and called in sick for the rest of the week. I told my supervisor I'd checked the house and found no issues, just old wiring creating false readings on the neighbor's phone sensors. Standard bureaucratic mix-up. Case closed. But it wasn't closed. Not for me. Because 3 days later, sitting in my own living room, my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID and felt my blood turn to ice. The number was my own. I let it go to voicemail. 2 hours later, it rang again. Same number. Same impossible caller. I haven't answered yet. But the calls are getting more frequent, and my voicemail box is full of messages from my own voice, each one more desperate than the last, all of them begging me not to make the same mistake. Sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection in the black screen of my television, and I swear I can see myself in a room that isn't my living room, holding a phone that shouldn't work, speaking to someone who might be me. The phone is ringing again as I write this. I've been staring at it for 7 minutes now, watching my own name flash on the display. Maybe this time I'll answer. Maybe this time I'll finally understand what happened in that house. Or maybe I'll just become another voice in the static, another version of myself trapped in a loop of impossible calls, warning someone who might still have a chance to escape. The ringing has stopped, but I know it will start again soon. They always do. Story 6. The mirror never lies, they say. But standing in the Grandview Ballroom at midnight, watching my reflection practice chasses across the warped hardwood floor, I'm beginning to think they're wrong. The rental agent had been eager, too eager, to hand over the keys. 3 months rent up front for a space that should have cost twice as much, and when I'd asked about the previous tenants, she'd simply mentioned something about the last dance studio closing in the mid-'80s. Personal reasons, she'd said, avoiding my eyes as she spoke. The way her fingers drummed against the lease agreement should have been warning enough. But I needed this place. After 15 years teaching at other people's studios, scraping together enough to finally open my own school, I couldn't afford to be particular about the building's history. The Grandview had good bones, 20-foot ceilings, original crown molding, and a wall of mirrors that ran the entire length of the main studio. The floor needed work, and the lighting system belonged in a museum, but the space had potential. That first week, I threw myself into preparations. I stripped decades of yellowed paint from the bars, replaced the ancient sound system, and spent hours trying to coax the overhead fixtures into providing even illumination. The mirrors, though spotted with age, still held their reflections true. When I practiced alone in the evenings, perfecting the combinations I'd teach my students, I could almost imagine the room as it must have been in its heyday, full of dancers, alive with movement and music. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I first noticed something wasn't quite right. I'd been working on a complex adagio sequence, moving slowly through the positions while counting under my breath. The studio was lit only by the emergency exit signs and the pale glow from the street lamps outside, casting everything in a dim, amber wash. As I moved into an arabesque, I caught sight of my reflection in the peripheral vision and stopped mid-movement. My reflection had continued the sequence. For just a moment, maybe half a second, I watched myself complete the arabesque while I stood frozen in an incomplete position. Then the reflection snapped back into alignment, mimicking my actual pose with perfect synchronization. I told myself it was fatigue. I'd been working 16-hour days getting the studio ready, surviving on coffee and determination. The mind plays tricks when pushed too hard, creates phantom movements in peripheral vision. I finished the combination and headed home, making a mental note to get more sleep. But sleep became elusive. I found myself lying awake, thinking about that moment of misalignment. Had I imagined it? Had the old mirror finally begun to warp, creating optical illusions? I'd read about buildings affecting their occupants, about spaces holding on to echoes of past events. The Grandview was old enough to have accumulated decades of stories, and empty long enough for those stories to ferment into something unsettling. My first group of students arrived on a Tuesday evening in October. 5 adults looking to rediscover movement, to recapture something they'd lost or never had. I'd planned an introductory class focusing on basic positions and simple combinations. Nothing too demanding. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across the floor, and I made another mental note to invest in softer lighting. We started with basic pliés at the bar, and I moved among the students, making small corrections, offering encouragement. That's when I noticed the extra shadows. In the mirror, alongside the reflections of my 5 students, additional shadows seemed to move. At first, I thought it was simply the interplay of light and reflection, the way the old fixtures threw confusing patterns across the glass. But as the class progressed, I realized the extra shadows were performing the exercises with perfect technique, demonstrating ideal form while my actual students struggled with basic positioning. During a break, one of my students, Sarah, a marketing executive trying to reconnect with her childhood ballet training, approached me with a puzzled expression. "I swear someone was helping me with my porte de bras," she said, massaging her shoulder. I felt hands guiding my arms into the correct position, but when I looked around, you were across the room with Michael. I offered some explanation about muscle memory and the way mirrors can create the illusion of guidance, but her words lodged themselves in my chest like a cold stone. After the class ended and the students filed out into the October night, I stood alone in the studio, staring at my reflection. "Show me," I whispered to the empty room. Nothing happened. The mirror showed only me, a 36-year-old man standing in an abandoned ballroom, talking to shadows that might not exist. The incidents escalated over the following weeks. Students reported feeling guided through difficult movements, sensing corrections being made to their posture by invisible hands. The old sound system began playing music on its own. scratchy recordings of orchestral pieces that seemed to emanate from somewhere within the walls themselves. I'd find the volume controls untouched, the input sources all disconnected, yet the music would swell and fade as if responding to some unseen conductor. I researched the building's history, spending hours in the public library's newspaper archives. The Grandview had been a premier dance venue through the 1960s and 70s, hosting everything from wedding receptions to professional recitals. But in 1983, something had changed. The coverage was sparse, sanitized. A dance studio had closed suddenly, cited creative differences, and scheduling conflicts. No details, no specific incident mentioned. But buried in the classified section of a November 1983 newspaper, I found a small notice. Missing dancer Monica Chen, age 24, last seen at Grandview Ballroom. Contact police with information. There had been no follow-up articles, no resolution mentioned in subsequent papers. The shadows grew bolder as winter approached. During classes, I began to see them more clearly in the mirrors, distinct figures moving through choreography that seemed both familiar and impossibly complex. They wore no faces, possessed no defining features, yet their movements held such precision, such artistic intensity, that I found myself studying their technique instead of focusing on my actual students. One evening in December, as I worked alone in the studio, the shadows began to teach me. I'd been struggling with a particularly challenging sequence, a piece I'd been developing for an advanced class. The movements required a specific quality of control, a way of moving through space that felt just beyond my reach. As I practiced, my reflection began to move differently, not the delayed response I'd noticed before, but as if it were leading, showing me the correct interpretation. I followed the shadow's guidance, letting my reflection teach me movements I'd never learned. The sequence was beautiful, haunting, a dance that seemed to tell a story of longing and loss, of reaching toward something forever out of grasp. My body moved with unusual fluency, as if the choreography had been embedded in my muscle memory long before I'd ever seen it. When I finished, the studio fell silent. Even the building's usual creaks and sighs seemed to pause. In the mirror, my reflection smiled, but I hadn't been smiling. That night, I dreamed of Monica Chen, though I'd never seen her photograph. In the dream, she was young and graceful, moving through the same sequence I'd learned from my reflection. She danced alone in the Grandview, her movements growing more desperate as she repeated the choreography over and over, each repetition pulling her deeper into something that looked like shadow, but felt like hunger. I woke with the certainty that I was losing my mind. But madness, I discovered, can be remarkably functional. I continued teaching, continued pretending that everything was normal while the shadows in my mirrors grew more insistent. They no longer waited for my students to leave. They danced openly during classes, demonstrating techniques that surpassed anything I could teach. My students improved rapidly, their movements taking on qualities that seemed almost supernatural in their precision and grace. "You're an amazing teacher," Sarah told me after a particularly intense session. "It's like you're channeling something ancient." If only she knew. The end came, predictably, during a lesson focused on the sequence I'd learned from my reflection. I decided to teach it to my advanced students, partly out of curiosity, partly because I could no longer resist the pull of those movements. The choreography felt essential now, like breathing or heartbeat, something my body needed to perform to maintain its connection to life. 4 students worked through the combination while I watched from the side of the studio. In the mirror, their shadows were joined by others, distinct figures moving with them, through them, guiding every gesture. The music that played seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a recording of something that might have been captured decades ago, or might have been created by the building itself. Marcus, one of my newer students, moved through the sequence with unusual confidence. His technique, normally adequate but unremarkable, had taken on a quality of inevitability, as if each movement were predestined. As he approached the final section of the choreography, I noticed that his reflection had begun to move slightly ahead of his actual body. "Stop," I called out, but my voice seemed to come from very far away. Marcus completed the sequence. For a moment, He stood perfectly still in the center of the studio, arms extended in the final position. Then he took a step backward and simply wasn't there anymore. But his reflection remained in the mirror, continuing to move through variations of the sequence, repeating the choreography with the same desperate intensity I'd seen in my dreams of Monica Chen. The other students looked around in confusion, asking where Marcus had gone, checking the bathroom and the changing area. I stood frozen, watching his reflection dance alone in the glass, knowing that I was the only one who could see him there. He must have slipped out during the combination, I heard myself explain, though the studio had only one exit, and I'd been watching it the entire time. After the students left, I remained in the studio, staring at Marcus's reflection. He seemed unaware of my presence, lost in the endless repetition of those haunting movements. In the corners of the mirror, other shadows danced as well. Figures that might have been Monica Chen, might have been dancers from decades past, might have been products of my deteriorating sanity. I find myself here most nights now, practicing that sequence, feeling my reflection move just slightly ahead of my actual body. The distance grows each time I perform the choreography, and I know that soon my reflection will complete the dance while I stand still, watching myself disappear into whatever exists on the other side of the mirror. The rational part of my mind insists this is all delusion. That isolation and stress have created an elaborate psychotic break. Perhaps Marcus simply left through a door I didn't notice. Perhaps the shadows are nothing more than tricks of light and projection. Perhaps I've been dancing alone in an empty building, talking to my own fractured psyche. But as I practice the sequence each night, feeling my reflection pull further away from my physical form, I wonder if madness is simply another word for a kind of seeing that most people aren't prepared to handle. If the spaces we occupy really do hold on to the echoes of past events, then the Grandview has been accumulating dancers for decades, collecting them like a museum collects artifacts. Soon, I'll complete the sequence. I can feel the choreography demanding its resolution, pulling me toward whatever exists in the space between reflection and reality. And perhaps that's not madness at all. Perhaps it's just another way of dancing. In the mirror, Marcus waves. I pretend not to see him and continue practicing, each movement bringing me closer to a truth I'm not sure I want to understand. The shadows gather around my reflection, ready to welcome another dancer to their eternal recital. The mirror never lies, they say, but they never mention what happens when the truth it shows becomes more real than the world it reflects. Story 7. The complaint started on a Tuesday. I'd been building manager of the Meridian Commercial Center for 3 years, and in that time I'd dealt with everything from burst pipes to belligerent tenants. But Mrs. Chen from the accounting firm on the 7th floor had a peculiar grievance that made my coffee taste bitter that morning. The service elevator, she insisted, had stopped on a floor that didn't exist. I assured her over the phone that elevators occasionally hiccuped. Maybe the display panel malfunctioned. Maybe she'd dozed off during the ride. These things happened in a building constructed in 1987, where the original blueprints had been updated so many times they resembled abstract art more than architectural plans. But then Dr. Harrison from the dental practice called with the same story. Then the law firm's receptionist. Always the service elevator, always between the 4th and 5th floors, always during off-peak hours when the main elevators were idle. By Friday, I knew I had to investigate. The service elevator squatted at the end of a narrow hallway like a metal mouth waiting to swallow whatever wandered too close. Its brushed steel doors reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting in fragmented patterns that seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The call button felt unusually cold under my finger, and the familiar ding that announced the elevator's arrival sounded muffled, as though filtered through water. Inside, the walls were lined with that industrial gray padding designed to protect against moving furniture and equipment. The smell hit me immediately, not the usual cocktail of cleaning supplies and recycled air, but something organic and stale, like breath exhaled in a closed room. The control panel showed the standard array of floor buttons, their worn plastic surfaces smooth from countless touches. I pressed the button for the 5th floor and felt the elevator lurch into motion. The ascent felt normal for the first few seconds. The familiar mechanical hum vibrated through the floor, and I watched the digital display count upward. 2, 3, 4. Then the elevator shuddered to a stop. The display showed nothing. Not a number, not an error message, just a blank green screen that pulsed gently like a sleeping eye. The doors remained closed for a moment that stretched into eternity, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing why. When they finally opened, my heart performed a stuttering dance against my ribs. The hallway beyond was identical to every other floor in the building. The same beige carpet with its geometric pattern, the same recessed lighting, the same wood veneer doors with brass nameplate holders. But the air that flowed into the elevator carried a weight that made my lungs work harder, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened into something more substantial than oxygen and nitrogen. I stepped out, telling myself I was investigating a mechanical malfunction, nothing more. The hallway stretched in both directions, its familiar dimensions somehow feeling wrong, like a photograph that had been subtly distorted. The silence was profound, not the quiet of an empty building, but an active, listening quiet that seemed to absorb sound before it could fully form. My footsteps on the carpet made no noise. That realization stopped me cold. I lifted my foot and let it fall deliberately, watching my dress shoe press into the beige fibers. Nothing. I tried again, harder, and my foot seemed to sink deeper than it should, as though the floor was yielding more than physics would allow. The overhead lights flickered in a rhythm that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. Not random electrical fluctuations, but a steady, organic pulse that made my skin crawl with recognition. It took me several seconds to understand what my subconscious had already grasped. The lights were beating like a heart. I moved down the hallway, past doors that bore no nameplates, no suite numbers, no indication of what lay beyond their wood veneer surfaces. The brass holders gleamed empty, reflecting the pulsing light in metallic heartbeats. I reached for the nearest door handle, and my hand passed through it like reaching into cold water. The sensation sent ice shooting up my arm and into my chest. I jerked back, staring at the handle that looked solid, felt solid when I tried again, but it offered no resistance to my touch moments before. My breathing quickened, and I noticed that each exhale seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, forming small clouds that dissipated too slowly in air that couldn't decide whether it was warm or cold. From somewhere down the hallway came the sound of voices. They were distant and indistinct, like conversations overheard through hotel walls, but they carried clearly in the thick silence. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was wrong. Too fast, then too slow. Syllables that seemed to repeat and overlap in patterns that human speech didn't follow. The voices rose and fell in waves, sometimes seeming to come from one direction, sometimes from everywhere at once. I followed the sound, or tried to. The hallway seemed to stretch as I walked, the voices always maintaining the same distance, always just out of range of comprehension. The doors I passed began to show subtle differences, scratches on the surfaces that formed patterns like letters in an alphabet I didn't recognize, brass handles that had tarnished in shapes that resembled faces when the light hit them just right. The carpet beneath my feet started to show wear patterns that made no sense. Deep grooves ran parallel to the walls, as though something heavy had been dragged repeatedly along the same path. But the grooves weren't continuous. They appeared and disappeared at random intervals, and some of them seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found the first object near what should have been the center of the building. It was a watch, a man's silver Rolex with an inscription on the back that read, "For James, on your retirement. Love, Sarah." The watch sat on the carpet as though someone had simply dropped it moments before, despite the fact that James Kowalski had been the previous building manager and had vanished 5 years ago during what everyone assumed was an early morning walk that had ended with him leaving town without notice. The watch was ticking. I picked it up with trembling fingers, and the metal was warm, as though it had recently been worn. The time displayed was 3:17 a.m., but my own watch showed 2:45 p.m. I held both timepieces up to compare them, and for a moment that made my vision blur. I could have sworn I saw my reflection in the Rolex's face, but older, grayer, with eyes that held a knowledge I didn't remember acquiring. The voices had stopped. The silence that replaced them was worse. pregnant with attention, as though invisible observers had suddenly turned their focus in my direction. The lights overhead continued their cardiac rhythm, but faster now, urgent and excited. I slipped the watch into my pocket and continued down the hallway, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. More objects appeared as I walked. A pair of reading glasses that belonged to Mrs. Hoffman, the elderly woman who'd run the flower shop on the ground floor before it had been converted to a cell phone store. A briefcase with the initials DT embossed in gold. David Torres, the lawyer who'd supposedly moved his practice to Denver after his lease expired. A red scarf that still carried the faint scent of perfume, though I couldn't remember who it might have belonged to. Each item was perfectly preserved, showing no signs of age or abandonment. They seemed to have been waiting, patiently maintaining their vigil in this space that existed between floors, between moments, between the world I knew and something else entirely. The hallway began to curve, though my rational mind insisted that the building's floor plan contained no curved corridors. The walls seemed to lean inward slightly, creating the impression of walking through the inside of a great tube. The doors became fewer and farther apart, and those that remained showed signs of age that the rest of the building lacked. Paint peeling in deliberate patterns, wood splitting along lines that formed symbols I almost recognized. I found the mirror at what felt like the end of the world. It hung on the wall where the hallway terminated in a surface that might have been metal, or might have been glass, or might have been something else entirely. The mirror's frame was ornate silver, tarnished black in places, and its surface reflected not just my image but layers of images. Me standing in the hallway, me walking through doors that shouldn't exist, me having conversations with people whose faces were always just out of focus. In one reflection, I was younger, wearing a security uniform I'd never owned. In another, I was older, my hair white and my face marked by lines I hadn't earned yet. The reflections moved independently, some mimicking my actions with a slight delay, others performing entirely different tasks, gesturing to unseen companions, reading documents that didn't exist, checking the very watch I'd found and tucked into my pocket. The worst reflection showed me screaming. I reached toward the mirror's surface, and my hand met cold resistance. But the reflection of my hand passed through the mirror like reaching into dark water, and I felt something on the other side grab hold of me with fingers that were both mine and not mine. I yanked my hand back and ran. The hallway had changed during my examination of the mirror. It now stretched infinitely in both directions, lined with doors that opened and closed in sequence like a mechanical wave. Through the opening doors, I caught glimpses of rooms that contained fragments of lives, desks with work left unfinished, coffee cups still steaming, phones ringing without answer. The elevator was gone. Where it should have been, the hallway simply continued, marked only by a rectangular indentation in the wall that might have been a door, or might have been a shadow, or might have been nothing more than my mind struggling to process something it couldn't understand. I pressed myself against the wall and tried to think rationally. Elevators didn't disappear. Floors didn't exist between other floors. Objects from missing persons didn't wait patiently in impossible hallways. There had to be an explanation. A gas leak causing hallucinations, a mental breakdown triggered by stress, an elaborate prank orchestrated by someone with too much time and technical skill. But the watch in my pocket continued to tick, warm against my leg, keeping time in a reality that ran parallel to my own. I began to walk, choosing a direction arbitrarily. The doors continued their opening and closing sequence, and I began to notice that the rooms beyond them were becoming more familiar. I saw my own office, complete with the stack of maintenance requests I'd left on my desk that morning. I saw my apartment, empty and waiting for my return. I saw places I'd been and places I'd dreamed of visiting, all existing simultaneously in this space that shouldn't exist. The lights overhead began to dim, their cardiac rhythm slowing to match what I realized was my own heartbeat. As the illumination faded, I became aware of other presences in the hallway, shadows that moved with purpose, shapes that watched from the edges of vision, voices that whispered my name in tones I almost recognized. I was not alone in this place, and I began to understand that I might never be alone again. The hallway ended where it had begun, at an elevator, but this one was different. The doors were open, revealing an interior that was simultaneously familiar and wrong. The gray padding on the walls showed wear patterns that matched my clothing, and the control panel bore fingerprints that could have been mine. The digital display showed my floor, the real 5th floor, but the numbers flickered occasionally, showing symbols that belonged to no human language. I stepped inside and the doors closed with a sound like a sigh. The descent felt like falling through honey, slow and inevitable. The display counted downward, but the numbers didn't match any sequence I understood. Sometimes it showed negative floors that couldn't exist in a building with a basement. Sometimes it showed decimals. Sometimes it showed nothing at all. When the doors finally opened, I was standing in the lobby of the Meridian Commercial Center. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, and the familiar sounds of office life, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, conversations floating between cubicles, filled the air like a symphony of normalcy. I checked my watch. 2:47 p.m. 2 minutes had passed since I'd entered the service elevator, but the watch in my pocket, James Kowalski's watch, showed 3:19 a.m. The security guard at the front desk waved me over with an expression of concern. He gestured to the bank of monitors that displayed feeds from cameras throughout the building and pointed to one particular screen that showed the service elevator. The timestamp read 11:23 a.m., 4.5 hours ago. On the screen, I watched myself enter the elevator, saw the doors close, and then nothing. For hours. The elevator remained motionless, the display blank, while the timestamp continued its relentless advance. Other cameras showed the building's normal daily routine, people coming and going, meetings beginning and ending, life continuing in the ordinary world I thought I knew. Then, at 2:45 p.m., the security guard pointed out another monitor. This one showed the 5th floor hallway, where a figure that looked exactly like me walked between offices, checking doors, examining windows, conducting what appeared to be a routine inspection. I had been in 2 places at once. The guard asked if I was feeling all right, mentioned that I'd seemed distracted lately, suggested that maybe I should consider taking some time off. He said these things while gesturing to the monitors, where both versions of me continued their separate existences, neither aware of the other. I thanked him and walked to my office, feeling the weight of the impossible watch in my pocket. My desk looked exactly as I'd left it that morning, but the maintenance request on top of the stack, the one that had prompted my investigation of the service elevator, was written in handwriting I didn't recognize, even though it was clearly mine. The request was dated 3 weeks in the future, and it described problems that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps had already happened in a version of reality that ran parallel to this one. The complaints it mentioned came from tenants I'd never met, in offices that didn't exist, about an elevator that had been perfect working condition until the day I'd decided to investigate it. At the bottom of the request, in my handwriting but not my words, was a note. Time moves differently between floors. The building remembers what hasn't happened yet. I locked the request in my desk drawer and tried to focus on the rest of my afternoon, but the watch in my pocket continued its alien timekeeping, marking hours that belonged to somewhere else. Every time I glanced at the security monitors, I saw myself in places I hadn't been, doing things I hadn't done, living a life that was mine but wasn't mine. As evening approached and the building emptied, I found myself standing in front of the service elevator again. The call button gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and I could hear mechanical sounds from behind the closed doors, not the normal hum of elevator machinery, but something more complex, like clockwork made of flesh and steel. The button felt warm under my finger, and when the doors opened, the interior looked exactly as it had that afternoon. But now I could see scratches on the gray padding that formed letters, and the control panel bore new fingerprints that overlapped my own like multiple exposures on an old photograph. I stepped inside, knowing I shouldn't, unable to stop myself. The doors closed with a sound like breathing, and the elevator began to move, not up or down, but sideways, diagonally, in directions that didn't exist in the three-dimensional world I thought I understood. The display showed impossible floors, negative numbers, symbols that shifted when I tried to focus on them. When the doors opened again, I was standing in the hallway that existed between existence, where the lights pulsed with my heartbeat, and objects from vanished lives waited patiently for their owner's return. But now I understood that the owners had returned. We all had, again and again, trapped in a cycle of investigation and discovery that played out in infinite variations across infinite floors, in a building that was bigger on the inside than the outside, deeper than its foundation, taller than its roof. I am the building manager of the Meridian Commercial Center, and I investigate complaints about the service elevator. I have always been investigating these complaints. I will always be investigating these complaints. The watch in my pocket continues to tick, keeping time for a life I've already lived and haven't lived yet, in a place that exists between the floors of reality, where the elevator stops at destinations that can only be reached by those who are already lost. Sometimes I remember that there's a world outside this building, a world where time moves in straight lines and elevators only go up and down. But that memory feels like a dream now, fading more each time I return to this hallway, this investigation, this moment of discovery that never ends. The doors are closing again, and I hear the familiar mechanical sigh that might be the building breathing, or might be my own soul settling into its eternal routine. The display shows a floor number I don't recognize, but I know I've been there before. I know I'll be there again. The complaints started on a Tuesday, and they will start again tomorrow, and I will investigate them with the same curiosity and growing dread, because that's what building managers do. We fix problems, even when the problems are us, even when the solution is to become part of the problem we were trying to solve. The elevator moves between floors, and I move with it, forever and always, investigating the space between what is and what isn't, managing a building that manages me in return. Story 8. And the first time it happened, I convinced myself it was condensation playing tricks on my eyes. I'd been living in the loft for exactly 3 weeks, when the morning shower routine began to feel different. The bathroom still carried the weight of decades. Original subway tiles from the 1950s lined the walls in perfect rows, their white surface now mellowed to cream. The mirror above the sink bore the same vintage authenticity, its silvering slightly foxed around the edges, creating dark spots that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Steam filled the small space as it always did, turning the mirror into a blank canvas of fog. I stepped out onto the cold tile, water still dripping from my hair, and reached for the towel hanging beside the mirror. That's when I saw it. You're not alone. 3 words, traced in the condensation as if invisible fingers had just finished writing them. The letters appeared crisp and deliberate, too precise to be random moisture patterns. My hand froze halfway to the towel, droplets from my hair hitting the floor with audible splashes that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. I stared at the message until the steam began to dissipate, watching the words fade letter by letter until only faint traces remained. My reflection gradually emerged through the clearing fog, pale, wide-eyed, water still beating on my shoulders. I looked exactly like someone who'd lost his mind. The rational part of my brain, the part that had built a successful design career on logic and precision, immediately began constructing explanations. Old building, unusual air currents, the way moisture moves across uneven surfaces. I'd read about pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns where none exist. People see faces in clouds, hear voices in white noise. This was just condensation, nothing more. But as I dried off, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the bathroom with me, standing just outside my peripheral vision, waiting for the steam to provide their canvas. The second incident occurred 4 days later. I'd been working late on a logo redesign for a local restaurant, my eyes strained from staring at the computer screen. The hot shower felt like a small salvation, steam building up even thicker than usual. When I stepped out, the mirror was completely opaque, a perfect white rectangle of fog. This time I watched it happen. A horizontal line appeared first, drawn slowly from left to right. Then a vertical stroke, followed by curves and angles that gradually formed letters. My heart hammered against my ribs as words materialized before my eyes. Remember the night you left home the first time? The message was longer this time, more personal. My throat went dry despite the humid air. I hadn't thought about that night in years. 17 years old, sneaking out through my bedroom window with a backpack full of stolen money from my mother's purse. I'd never told anyone about that night. Not my ex-wife during our brief marriage, not my closest friends, not even my therapist during those dark months after the divorce. The steam began to clear, and I watched my reflection emerge again, but this time something felt wrong about it. The man in the mirror looked familiar but distant, like seeing an old photograph of yourself and struggling to remember when it was taken. His eyes held an expression I didn't recognize, a mixture of fear and something else. Recognition, maybe, or guilt. I reached toward the mirror, my fingertip nearly touching the glass before I stopped myself. What if the surface felt warm where the letters had been? What if I could feel the residual heat from whatever had written them? Instead, I grabbed my phone from the bathroom counter and took a picture. Through the camera's lens, the mirror showed only normal condensation patterns, random droplets and streaks with no discernible message. But when I looked up from the phone, the words were still there, fading but visible. The photograph showed nothing but my own reflection in a steamy mirror. That's when I started keeping a journal. Day 25 in the loft. Message appeared during morning shower. Remember the night you left home the first time? Photo shows nothing. Checked building history. No deaths, no unusual incidents. Previous tenant lived here 12 years, moved out for job relocation. Building manager says no other complaints about the bathroom. Day 27. No message today. Showered normally. Almost disappointed. Day 29. Message appeared on bathroom window during evening shower. You were supposed to turn left. Makes no sense. Never took any photographs of bathroom window before, so no comparison. Day 31. Woke up to find message on bedroom window. First time outside bathroom. The choice you didn't make. Window faces air shaft. No way someone could write from outside. The messages were becoming more frequent, appearing on any surface where moisture could collect. The kitchen window while cooking pasta. My coffee mug while the steam rose from hot liquid. Even my laptop screen when it overheated during rendering. Each message was more personal than the last, referencing decisions and moments I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten them myself. You were supposed to turn left. That one haunted me for days until I remembered. 10 years ago, driving home from work, I'd come to an intersection where my usual route was blocked by construction. I'd turned right instead of left, taking an unfamiliar street that led me past a small art gallery. In the window hung a painting that would later inspire my most successful design campaign, the one that established my reputation in the industry. If I'd turned left, if I'd taken the detour around the construction in the other direction, I would never have seen that painting. My entire career trajectory might have been different. But how could anyone else know about such a trivial decision? How could anyone else understand its significance in the context of my life? Day 38. Messages appearing daily now. She would have said yes if you'd asked. Refers to Sarah from college. I never asked her out. Always wondered what would have happened if I had. You weren't supposed to sell the house. About Mom's house after she went into assisted living. I needed the money for the divorce, but I regretted it immediately. Day 40. Realized something disturbing. Tried writing my name on fogged mirror with finger. My handwriting looks exactly like the messages, but reversed. Like looking at my own writing in a mirror. That discovery led me down a rabbit hole of research into mirror writing, automatic writing, dissociative episodes. I found case studies of people who'd experienced periods of memory loss, only to discover they'd been writing messages to themselves without conscious awareness. The condition was often triggered by stress, trauma, major life changes. I'd certainly experienced all three in recent months. The divorce had been finalized just before I moved into the loft. My mother's dementia had progressed rapidly, leaving me feeling unmoored from my own history. The move itself represented a complete upheaval of my routine, my environment, my sense of self. Maybe I was writing these messages during some kind of fugue state. Maybe the stress had fractured my perception of time and memory, creating gaps where my subconscious mind could operate without my knowledge. But that didn't explain the sensation of being watched that had grown stronger each day. It didn't explain why I sometimes felt compelled to look over my shoulder while showering, or why I'd started avoiding eye contact with my own reflection. Day 44. Found wet footprints on bathroom floor this morning. Size 10, same as mine. But I hadn't showered yet. Floor was dry when I went to bed. Day 46. Message appeared while I was watching it happen. You need to go back. Back where? To the house I sold? To the intersection where I turned right? To the night I left home at 17? Day 48. Tried sleeping in living room to avoid bathroom. Woke up at 3 a.m. to find message on bedroom window. Stop running. The messages had begun issuing commands. Go to the basement. Check the foundation stones. Find the loose brick behind the furnace. Look for what you left behind. I'd been living in the loft for 7 weeks when I finally followed the instructions. The basement was a cramped space beneath the building, accessible through a door I'd noticed but never opened. The furnace squatted in one corner like a sleeping beast, surrounded by the building's original stone foundation. Behind the furnace, exactly where the messages had indicated, I found a brick that shifted when I touched it. Inside the hollow space behind it, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a small leather journal. My hands shook as I opened it. The pages were filled with my own handwriting, not the reversed mirror script I'd grown accustomed to, but my normal writing, left to right, exactly as I'd written everything for the past 30 years. Day 1. Moved into the loft today. Strange feeling, like I've been here before. Day 3. Message appeared on bathroom mirror. Thought I was losing my mind. Day 8. Starting to understand. The messages aren't from someone else. They're from me, but not this me. The me who made different choices. Day 12. Found the journal today. If you're reading this, it means you're ready to understand. Every decision creates a branch, a path not taken. This place exists at the intersection of those paths. Day 15. You turned right at the intersection. I turned left. You sold the house. I kept it. You divorced her. I fought for the marriage. We're the same person, but we're living different versions of the same life. Day 18. The mirror isn't reflecting your image. It's reflecting mine. Every time you see yourself, you're looking at the life you might have lived. Day 22. The messages will stop when you accept the choice. Go back to the intersection. Turn left this time. Find your way to the life you were supposed to live. Day 25. I'm leaving this for you to find. When you're ready, you'll know what to do. The bathroom mirror isn't just a mirror, it's a doorway. I read the journal 3 times before I understood what it was telling me. The handwriting was mine, but the memories described weren't memories I possessed. In this other life, the other me had made different choices at every crucial moment. He'd turned left at the intersection, kept the family house, fought to save his marriage. But if that was true, then what was I? Standing in the basement, holding a journal written in my own hand that described a life I'd never lived, I felt my grip on reality begin to slip. The foundation stones around me seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and I could hear water running somewhere in the walls, though no pipes were visible. When I returned to the bathroom that evening, I didn't turn on the shower. Instead, I stood in front of the mirror and waited. Slowly, without any steam to write in, letters began to appear on the glass itself, etched from the inside surface. It's time to come home. The mirror began to cloud over despite the lack of hot water, as if steam were rising from the glass itself. My reflection grew dim and distant, and for a moment I could see another face looking back at me. My own face, but wearing expressions I'd never made, carrying the weight of decisions I'd never had the courage to follow through on. The other me pressed his hand against the glass from the inside, and I found myself raising my own hand to match his palm to palm. The surface felt warm, then hot, then began to give way like thick liquid. As my hand passed through the mirror, I felt myself being pulled forward into the reflection, into the life I should have lived, leaving behind only empty space where my choices had brought me. The loft would be empty in the morning, with no trace that anyone had ever lived there except for wet footprints on the bathroom floor, and a message slowly fading from the mirror. Welcome home. Whether I stepped through to a better life or simply dissolved into the madness that had been building for weeks, I'll never know. But somewhere in the space between reflections, between the choices we make and the ones we don't, there's a place where all possibilities exist simultaneously. And sometimes, if you look long enough into your own reflection, you might catch a glimpse of the person you could have been, reaching back toward the life you actually lived, wondering if they made the right choice after all. Story 9. The first thing that struck me about Meridian Studios wasn't the impressive mixing board or the vintage microphones hanging like sleeping bats from the ceiling. It was the silence. Not the absence of sound. I'm an acoustic engineer. I know the difference. But a silence that felt wrong, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Marcus Brennan, the studio owner, led me through the control room with the nervous energy of a man trying to sell a haunted house. His explanation came in rapid bursts, punctuated by glances at the walls, as though expecting them to interrupt. The previous engineer couldn't figure it out, he said, running his fingers through graying hair. Phantom sounds bleeding into the recordings. Sometimes it's just static, but other times... He trailed off, shaking his head. You'll hear for yourself soon enough. I'd been called in to solve acoustic mysteries before. Studios had their quirks, old buildings settling, HVAC systems creating sympathetic vibrations, even neighboring businesses causing interference. But as I set up my equipment in the main recording booth, something felt different about this place. The walls seemed to listen. My initial measurements revealed standard acoustic properties. The room had been professionally treated with absorption panels and bass traps, though I noticed they'd been installed in an unusual pattern. Instead of the typical parallel arrangement, they formed a complex geometric design that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. The first anomaly appeared during my baseline frequency sweep. At 28 Hz, well below the threshold of human hearing, my spectrum analyzer detected a sustained tone that shouldn't have existed. I checked my equipment twice, then traced every cable connection. The tone remained, steady and inexplicable, like a deep breath that never ended. That's when I heard the first knock. 3 measured beats from inside the east wall, perfectly timed with my frequency generator. I switched off the equipment. Silence returned, but only for a moment. Then came 3 more knocks, identical in timing and intensity, as if something was trying to maintain a conversation I'd inadvertently started. Marcus had mentioned unexplained sounds, but he'd failed to convey their intelligence. These weren't random creaks or settling noises. They were responses. I pressed my ear against the wall where the sounds originated. The surface felt warm, almost feverish, and I could swear I detected a subtle vibration, like a massive tuning fork resonating at frequencies too low to hear, but deep enough to feel in my bones. Over the next 2 hours, I documented 17 distinct anomalies, frequencies that appeared without input, standing waves that formed impossible patterns, and most disturbing of all, what sounded like whispered conversations embedded in the room's natural reverb. When I isolated these audio fragments and ran them through spectral analysis software, the results made my hands shake. The waveforms, when visualized, weren't random noise patterns. They formed shapes, geometric designs that echoed the absorption panel arrangement on the walls. And in the gaps between frequencies, in the spaces where silence should have lived, I found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about sound. Voices. Clear human voices having conversations that couldn't possibly be happening in an empty room. The first voice belonged to a woman discussing microphone placement for a session that, according to the time-stamped metadata, was scheduled for next Tuesday. The second was a man's voice, older and gravelly, complaining about acoustic bleed-through during a recording that the file properties indicated had taken place 3 months ago. I sat back in my chair, staring at the monitor. Either my equipment was malfunctioning in the most sophisticated way imaginable, or I was documenting conversations that existed outside normal temporal boundaries. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in physics and engineering, searched for logical explanations. Perhaps the building's structure was acting as a massive resonating chamber, somehow storing and replaying acoustic information like a natural recording device. But even as I constructed these theories, a deeper understanding was taking root. I'd seen this pattern before. 20 years ago, during my graduate studies in architectural acoustics, I'd encountered a research paper that had haunted me ever since. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a brilliant but controversial acoustician, had theorized that certain architectural proportions could create what she called dimensional apertures, acoustic configurations that might theoretically allow sound to travel through space and time. The academic community had dismissed her work as fringe science, but standing in Meridian Studios, surrounded by absorption panels arranged in her precise mathematical ratios, I felt the chill of recognition. Someone had built the studio according to Vasquez's specifications. I pulled up the building's architectural plans on my laptop, cross-referencing them with the equations from Vasquez's discredited research. The correlation was perfect. Every angle, every surface treatment, every acoustic element had been positioned to create what her paper described as a temporal resonance chamber. But Vasquez had warned of dangers. In her final paper, published just months before her mysterious disappearance, she'd cautioned that such chambers might not simply allow sound to travel through time, but could potentially open pathways for other things as well. As I read her words on my screen, the temperature in the studio seemed to drop. The silence deepened, becoming so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the walls. And beneath that familiar rhythm, I detected something else. A second heartbeat, slightly faster than mine, coming from somewhere inside the east wall. I approached the wall with my most sensitive contact microphone, pressing it against the surface. The sound was unmistakable, a human heart beating in distress, as if someone was trapped within the structure itself. But that was impossible. The building plans showed solid concrete behind the acoustic treatment. The heartbeat continued for 37 seconds before fading into silence. In its absence, I heard something far worse. My own voice, distorted by reverb and distance, calling out from the other side of the wall. But I hadn't spoken. The voice, mine yet not mine, was asking someone named Elena if she could hear him, begging her to explain what was happening, why the walls were breathing and the sounds wouldn't stop. The desperation in that familiar voice made my skin crawl because I recognized the tone. It was the sound of a man losing his grip on reality. I backed away from the wall, my rational mind finally surrendering to the impossible truth. This wasn't malfunction or misinterpretation. The studio had somehow become what Vasquez had theorized, a place where sound could transcend normal physical boundaries, where conversations could bleed through from other times, other realities, and something was using those pathways to communicate. The absorption panels began to resonate, each one humming at a slightly different frequency. Together, they created a chord progression that felt ancient and hungry. In the harmonics between notes, I could hear fragments of conversations, engineers from different decades discovering the same impossibilities I was experiencing, their voices layering into a chorus of confusion and growing fear. I realized with horrible clarity that I wasn't the first acoustic engineer to stand in this room and witness these phenomena. Marcus had hired others before me, probably many others, and they'd all encountered the same inexplicable recordings, the same impossible frequencies, the same voices bleeding through from times that shouldn't exist. But where were they now? My equipment registered a massive spike in electromagnetic activity as every surface in the room began to vibrate in perfect synchronization. The sound was beautiful and terrifying, a chord so complex it seemed to contain entire symphonies within each note. And riding on those impossible harmonics, I heard a voice I recognized from academic lectures and dusty research papers. Dr. Elena Vasquez was speaking from somewhere beyond the walls, her words distorted by decades of acoustic imprisonment, but still intelligible. She was trying to warn me about something, her voice urgent with the desperation of someone who'd been calling out unheard for far too long. But her warning was interrupted by another voice, mine again, but different somehow, older, more resigned. This version of myself was explaining to someone that the studio had to be destroyed, that the acoustic apertures were allowing something through that shouldn't exist in our reality. That's when I understood the true horror of my situation. I wasn't just discovering the studio's secrets. I was becoming part of them. My voice, my presence, my growing understanding of what this place really was. All of it was being absorbed into the temporal loop that Vasquez had accidentally created. Every engineer who'd worked here had become trapped in the acoustic structure itself, their consciousness preserved in the standing waves and resonant frequencies. The room was a collection point for human awareness, gathering minds like insects in amber, storing them in the spaces between sounds where time moved differently. I grabbed my equipment and headed for the exit, but the door wouldn't open. Not locked, simply non-responsive, as if it had forgotten how to function as a door. The walls continued their harmonic progression, and I could hear new voices joining the chorus. Engineers, musicians, studio technicians, all of them calling out from their acoustic prison, trying to warn newcomers about a trap they'd only understood too late. My hands shook as I reached for my phone to call Marcus, but the screen showed no signal, no service provider, no time, no date. Just a blank display that reflected my face like a black mirror. That's when I noticed my reflection was moving independently. The face in the phone screen was speaking, lips forming words I couldn't hear, eyes wide with terror I was only beginning to understand. It was trying to warn me about something behind me, something that existed in the spaces between sounds where physics broke down and consciousness could survive without flesh. I turned, but the studio looked the same as before. Empty equipment racks, absorption panels humming their impossible chords, mixing board lights blinking in patterns that reminded me of neural activity. But now I could see what my reflection had been trying to show me. The studio wasn't empty at all. Dozens of translucent figures moved through the space, each one trapped at the moment of their final understanding. Engineers with their hands pressed against walls that no longer led anywhere. Musicians holding instruments that played sounds from other dimensions. And at the center of it all, Dr. Elena Vasquez herself, still working at equations that had become reality, trying to find a way to close the apertures she'd accidentally opened. I approached her flickering form, and she looked up from calculations written in light and frequency. Her eyes held decades of regret, and a warning I was too late to heed. The acoustic apertures weren't just allowing sound to travel through time, they were preventing anything that entered their influence from ever truly leaving. The studio had become a temporal dead end, a place where consciousness could check in, but never check out. As this realization settled over me like a funeral shroud, I felt my own solidity beginning to fade. My hands were becoming translucent, my voice taking on the same ethereal quality as the others trapped here. But I'm still fighting it, still trying to find a solution that Vasquez never could. Because somewhere in the frequencies that bind us here, in the harmonics that hold our minds prisoner, there might be a key to undoing what was never meant to be done. I'm writing this while I still can, while some part of me remains anchored to the world beyond these walls. If you're reading it, if somehow this account has escaped the acoustic prison that holds everything else, then please, listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Meridian Studios is still operational. Marcus is still hiring engineers, and the voices behind the walls are still calling out, still trying to warn people like me who think they can solve what was never meant to be solved. Don't answer when the walls start knocking back. Don't trust the silence that feels like it's listening. And whatever you do, don't try to measure frequencies that shouldn't exist, because once you acknowledge their presence, once you give them the attention they crave, they'll never let you leave. I can hear my own voice now, coming from the walls themselves, warning the next engineer about dangers I'm only beginning to understand. The cycle continues. The studio collects another consciousness, and somewhere in the spaces between sounds, Elena Vasquez keeps working on equations that might someday set us all free. Or maybe that's just what I need to believe to keep from losing what's left of my mind. Either way, the recording is almost complete, and I think I'm beginning to understand what the voices have been trying to tell us all along. We were never meant to hear what lives in the silence between sounds, but now that we have, we can never stop listening. Story 10. The Meridian building had 43 floors, but only 42 mattered to me. The 43rd had been sealed off for renovations that never seemed to happen, its entrance blocked by yellow caution tape and a rusty padlock that looked older than my tenure here. I'd been the night janitor for 8 years, and in all that time, nobody had bothered to explain why the top floor remained perpetually under construction. Not that I minded. Fewer floors meant less work, and working alone suited me fine. The building emptied out by 7 p.m., leaving me with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant whisper of the HVAC system for company. It was peaceful, predictable, exactly what I needed after everything that had happened before. The first time I heard the footsteps, I was mopping the 42nd floor's main corridor. The sound came from directly above me, a steady, deliberate pace that matched my own movements exactly. Step for step, as if someone was shadowing me from the ceiling. I stopped pushing the mop and listened. The footsteps stopped too. I resumed cleaning. The footsteps resumed. My rational mind kicked in immediately. Old buildings settle, pipes expand and contract. Mice could sound bigger than they were in the right acoustics. I'd heard stranger things echoing through these walls over the years. But when I moved to the eastern wing, the footsteps followed, maintaining perfect synchronization with my own rhythm. When I backed up to retrieve a dropped paper towel, I swear I heard whatever was up there backing up too. The next night, I brought a small radio to keep me company. The classic rock station helped drown out my growing unease, but even Leonard Skynerd couldn't mask the sound when it started again around midnight. This time, the footsteps seemed heavier, more pronounced. I turned off the radio and stood perfectly still in the accounting department's cubicle maze. Silence stretched for nearly a minute. Then, just as I convinced myself it was my imagination, I heard it. A single, unmistakable footstep directly overhead. Then another, and another. Moving away from me now, heading toward what would have been the conference room on the floor above. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the emergency stairs. The 43rd floor's door bore a faded sign, authorized personnel only, hard hat area. The padlock hung open. That stopped me cold. I'd checked that lock 100 times over the years, rattling it out of boredom during my rounds. It had always been secure, the key supposedly held by some corporate office downtown that nobody at the building seemed able to contact. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo throughout the stairwell. My flashlight beam cut through absolute darkness beyond the threshold. The air that rushed out smelled of dust and something else. Something stale and organic, like old clothes left too long in a damp basement. The floor was gutted, just as I'd expected. Exposed beams crossed overhead like ribs, and plastic sheeting hung in tatters from the ceiling. Construction equipment sat abandoned beneath layers of dust so thick they looked like furniture covers. But what caught my attention were the footprints in that dust. Fresh footprints. They started just inside the doorway and led deeper into the darkness. The prints were roughly my size, with the distinctive waffle pattern of work boots similar to my own. But these prints were different somehow, deeper than they should have been, as if made by someone much heavier than me, or someone pressing down with deliberate force. I followed them through what had once been the reception area, past abandoned sawhorses and stacks of drywall that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The prints led to the center of what would have been the main conference room and then simply stopped. Not at a wall or a door or even a pile of debris. They ended in the middle of empty space, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand as I examined the final print. The heel was pressed deeper than the toe, suggesting whoever had been here had stopped suddenly, perhaps looking up or behind them. Around that last print, the dust was disturbed in a perfect circle, as if something had spun or pivoted on that exact spot. I backed away slowly, my own footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the empty space. As I reached the door, I heard it, a soft whisper of movement somewhere in the darkness behind me. Not footsteps this time, but something else. Something like fabric brushing against fabric, or papers rustling in a non-existent breeze. The next few nights passed without incident, but the memory of those footprints haunted me. I found myself looking up at the ceiling constantly, straining to hear sounds that might or might not be there. The building felt different somehow, as if the very air had become thicker, more oppressive. My usual efficiency suffered as I caught myself stopping mid-task to listen for sounds from above. On Thursday night, the footsteps returned with a vengeance. This time, they didn't just mirror my movements, they anticipated them. As I approached the elevator bank on the 38th floor, I heard whatever was up there arrive at the same location before I did. When I changed direction toward the bathroom, the footsteps were already heading that way. The sensation of being one step behind something that should have been one step behind me was deeply unsettling. It was as if my shadow had broken free and learned to move independently, always managing to reach our shared destination first. By Friday, objects began falling from the ceiling. The first was a ballpoint pen that clattered onto my cart as I cleaned the marketing department. I looked up but saw only the standard acoustic tiles, showing no sign of disturbance. The pen was unremarkable except for one detail. It was the same brand I'd been using for years, a promotional item from a bank that had closed down in my neighborhood 6 years ago. I distinctly remembered losing a pen just like it during my second week on the job. Over the following nights, more items appeared. A torn photograph of a sunset I'd taken during a vacation to Oregon 15 years ago. A button from a winter coat I'd donated to charity after my divorce. A ticket stub from a movie I'd seen with my ex-wife during our last attempt at reconciliation. Each item was something personal, something I'd lost or given away, yet here they were, dropping from a ceiling that should have contained nothing but insulation and electrical wiring. The most unsettling arrival was a small brass key attached to a keychain shaped like a lighthouse. I recognized it immediately. It had opened the front door of my childhood home in Delaware. I'd carried it for years after my parents sold the house, a sentimental token I'd eventually misplaced during a move. The metal was warm when I picked it up, as if someone had been holding it. I started keeping a list of the falling objects, noting the time and location of each appearance. A pattern emerged. They always fell when I was directly beneath them, never when I was across the room or around a corner. Whatever was dropping these items wanted to make sure I saw them, wanted to make sure I understood they were meant for me. Sleep became elusive. During my days off, I found myself researching the building's history, diving into property records and architectural plans. The Meridian building had been constructed in 1987, and according to every official document I could find, it had always been a 42-story structure. No mention of a 43rd floor, no indication that additional levels had ever been planned or built. Yet the sounds continued, always from above, always from that impossible space. On a particularly quiet Tuesday night, I discovered something that changed everything. While organizing some old maintenance files in the building manager's office, a space I was trusted to clean but usually avoided due to its chaos of paperwork, I found a manila folder marked Original Plans, 1985 Revision. The architectural drawings inside showed a 44-story building. I spread the blueprints across the manager's desk, weighing down the corners with staplers and tape dispensers. According to these plans, the Meridian building had been designed with 2 additional floors beyond what actually existed. The 43rd floor was labeled as Executive Conference and Planning, while the 44th was designated Private Offices and Storage. But here's what made my hands shake as I studied the drawings. The 43rd floor's layout perfectly matched the gutted space I'd explored. Every room, every wall placement, every detail corresponded exactly to what I'd seen in that dust-covered wasteland above me. The conference room where the footprints ended was clearly marked on the blueprint, positioned precisely where I'd found that final mysterious shoe print. The 44th floor, however, was different. According to the plans, it should have been directly above the 43rd, but when I'd been up there in the darkness, I'd seen only exposed ceiling beams and building infrastructure. There had been no indication of another complete floor above. I rolled up the blueprints and took them with me, stuffing them into my supply cart like contraband. The building manager rarely visited anymore, and I doubted he'd miss plans that were obviously outdated. But as I continued my rounds that night, The footsteps returned with renewed intensity. They were coming from the 44th floor now, from the floor that didn't exist. The sounds were different up there. Heavier, more purposeful. While the 43rd floor footsteps had seemed to mirror or anticipate my movements, these new sounds suggested someone moving with independent intent. I could hear what sounded like furniture being dragged across a floor that shouldn't exist, doors opening and closing in offices that were never built. I stood in the 42nd floor's break room, head tilted back, listening to what sounded like a complete workday happening 20 feet above me in empty space. Chairs rolling across floors, papers rustling, the distinctive sound of filing cabinet drawers being opened and closed. Once, I could have sworn I heard the muffled ring of a telephone. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. Buildings don't spontaneously generate additional floors. Sounds don't emerge from architectural spaces that were never constructed. But the evidence was literally falling on my head, and the blueprints in my cart suggested a reality more complex than what my eyes could perceive. Late Thursday night, as I cleaned the 39th floor, a new object fell from the ceiling. This time it wasn't something from my past. It was something from my present. My employee ID badge, which I was certain I'd clipped to my shirt pocket before starting my shift, clattered onto the floor beside my feet. I immediately checked my pocket. The badge was gone. But that was impossible. I just walked through the elevator lobby, where the security system would have detected the absence of my badge immediately. The building's access controls were sensitive enough to lock down entire floors if someone without proper credentials attempted entry. Yet somehow my badge had traveled from my pocket to a floor that didn't exist and back down to me, all without triggering any alarms. I looked up at the ceiling tiles above me. They appeared completely normal, standard acoustic panels in their aluminum grid framework. But one tile, directly overhead, seemed slightly askew. Not enough to be noticeable unless you were looking for it, but enough to suggest it had been recently disturbed. Using a stepladder from my cart, I climbed up and carefully moved the tile aside. The space beyond was exactly what I expected. Insulation, ductwork, and electrical cables running through the building's infrastructure. But there was something else. A small opening in the concrete slab above, just large enough for a human hand to reach through. The opening was perfectly round, with edges that looked almost intentional, as if someone had carefully drilled through the floor of the level above. When I shone my flashlight into the hole, the beam disappeared into what appeared to be a much larger space than the cramped area between floors should have allowed. As I stared into that impossible opening, a single drop of water landed on my forehead, then another, and another. But the drops were warm, and when I wiped them away, my fingers came back stained with something that looked like dust mixed with oil. From somewhere far above me, beyond the reach of my flashlight, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not walking this time, but running. Running toward the opening I was peering through. I replaced the ceiling tile and climbed down from the ladder faster than was probably safe. My hands were shaking as I packed up my equipment, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder as I finished my rounds. The sounds from above continued. Sometimes footsteps, sometimes other noises I couldn't identify. Once, I could have sworn I heard someone calling my name, but the voice was so faint and distorted that I couldn't be sure. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove to the city planning office. The clerk who helped me was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who seemed genuinely puzzled by my request for building permits and construction records for the Meridian building. After spending 20 minutes in the archives, she returned with a thick folder and an apologetic expression. "This is odd," she told me, spreading documents across the counter between us. According to our records, the Meridian building received permits for 44 floors in 1985, but the certificate of occupancy was only issued for 42 floors in 1987. There's no record of what happened to the additional levels, and no permits for any demolition work. She showed me the original permit application, which clearly stated the building's intended height as 44 stories. But subsequent documents, inspections, occupancy certificates, tax assessments, all referenced a 42-story structure. Sometimes plans change during construction, she explained. but her tone suggested she found the lack of documentation as troubling as I did. Budget constraints, zoning issues, that sort of thing. But usually there's a paper trail. This looks like those 2 floors just disappeared from the records. I spent the weekend researching construction companies, building contractors, anyone who might have been involved in the Meridian Building's development. Most of the businesses had closed down or been absorbed by larger firms, but I eventually tracked down a retired foreman named Gil Hennessy, who'd worked on the project. Hennessy was in his 70s now, living in a modest house in the suburbs. When I called and explained my interest in the building, he invited me over for coffee and seemed eager to discuss his old projects. But when I mentioned the missing floors, his demeanor changed completely. "You working there now?" he asked, studying my face carefully. When I confirmed that I was the night janitor, he was quiet for a long time. "Those floors got built," he finally said. "Both of them. I supervised the concrete work myself. But about a week before the final inspection, we got orders to seal them off, make them inaccessible. The boss said there'd been a change in the lease agreements, that the top 2 floors were being reserved for some kind of special tenant who wanted complete privacy." He paused, staring into his coffee cup. "We blocked the stairwell access and sealed the elevator shafts so the cars couldn't reach those levels. But the floors themselves? They're still there. Finished, furnished, ready for occupancy. As far as I know, nobody's ever set foot in them since we locked them up." I asked him about access points, about how someone might reach those sealed floors. Hennessy shook his head slowly. "There shouldn't be any way up there. We made sure of that. Unless..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Unless what?" "Unless someone's been using the maintenance shafts. There's a service ladder that runs the full height of the building for HVAC work, but it's supposed to be locked at the 42nd floor. If someone had the right tools, though, they could probably cut through that lock." That night, I arrived at work with a new sense of purpose. Armed with Hennessy's information and my own growing pile of evidence, I was determined to solve the mystery of the Meridian Building's missing floors. The footsteps had become a nightly occurrence now, sometimes lasting for hours. The falling objects had increased too, items from my past appearing with disturbing regularity, each one a reminder of some moment or person I'd tried to leave behind. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the sounds from above seemed almost welcoming, as if whatever was up there was finally ready to be discovered. I found the maintenance shaft exactly where Hennessy had said it would be, behind a locked door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" in the 42nd floor's utility room. The lock was old but sturdy, though I noticed fresh scratches around the keyhole that suggested someone had been picking it recently. My master key, which opened most of the building's service areas, turned the lock easily. The shaft beyond was a narrow vertical tunnel lined with metal ladder rungs. My flashlight beam revealed that the ladder continued upward far beyond where it should have ended. According to the building's official blueprints, this shaft should have terminated at the 42nd floor, but I could see rungs extending into darkness above me. I began to climb. The ascent felt endless, though it couldn't have been more than 40 feet to the level that should have been the 43rd floor. As I climbed, I became aware of sounds echoing through the shaft. Not footsteps this time, but something like voices. Muffled conversation, as if several people were having a meeting somewhere above me. At what should have been the 43rd floor, I found a service hatch. It was unlocked. I pushed it open and emerged into a space that defied everything I thought I knew about the building. This wasn't the gutted construction zone I'd seen when I'd climbed the emergency stairs. This was a fully finished, fully furnished office environment. Carpeted hallways led off in multiple directions, lined with office doors bearing nameplates. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the familiar, slightly harsh glow of corporate workspaces. But it was wrong. Everything was wrong. The carpet was the exact pattern that had been installed in the Meridian Building's main floors during my first year of employment, a pattern that had been replaced building-wide 3 years ago. The office furniture was the same style that had been removed during a renovation I'd personally witnessed. Even the motivational posters on the walls were ones I remembered discarding when the company had updated their decor. It was as if this floor existed in a different time, preserving a version of the building that no longer existed anywhere else. I walked slowly down the main corridor, reading the nameplates on the office doors. Some names I recognized, former employees who'd worked in the building during my early years, people who'd been laid off, transferred, or who'd simply moved on to other jobs. But their offices were here, exactly as they'd been years ago, right down to the personal photos on their desks and the coffee-stained calendars on their walls. At the end of the hallway, I found an office with my own name on the door, but I'd never had an office in this building. I was a janitor, not an executive. My office was a utility closet on the ground floor where I stored my equipment. Yet here was a door bearing a nameplate that read, Brian Kellerman, Facilities Management. I opened the door and stepped inside. The office was everything I'd never known I wanted. A large desk faced a window that should have offered an impossible view of the city, but instead looked out onto a landscape I recognized from my childhood in Delaware. Family photos lined the shelves, pictures of my parents before their divorce, images of my ex-wife during our happier years, snapshots of a life that might have been if I'd made different choices. On the desk was a leather-bound appointment book, open to today's date. Every hour was blocked out with meetings and tasks, a full schedule of the kind of important, meaningful work I'd sometimes imagined doing during my lonelier nights of mopping floors and emptying trash cans. As I stood there, taking in this impossible version of my professional life, I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. Not the mysterious sounds I'd been hearing from below, but normal footsteps. Human footsteps. Someone was walking around out there, moving between offices as if this was just another workday. I stepped back into the hallway and saw him immediately. It was me, or rather, it was a version of me. Same height, same build, but wearing a pressed business suit instead of my custodial uniform. This other Brian was carrying a briefcase and walking with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this corporate environment. He looked up and saw me standing there in my janitor's clothes, and his expression shifted from professional concentration to something like recognition. Then he smiled, a sad, knowing smile that seemed to contain years of disappointment and resignation. "You're earlier than usual," this other version of myself said, his voice exactly like mine, but somehow carrying more authority. I was just finishing up for the day. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask who he was or what this place was, but no words came out. Instead, I watched as this alternate Brian walked past me toward the elevator bank at the end of the hall. He pressed the call button, and I heard the familiar ding of an arriving car. As the elevator doors opened, he turned back to me one last time. "The 44th floor is where it gets interesting," he said. "That's where you'll find the answers you're looking for. But be careful. Once you understand what this place really is, you can't unknow it." The doors closed, and he was gone. I stood alone in that impossible hallway, surrounded by the corporate life I'd never lived, trying to process what I'd just experienced. Part of me wanted to run back to the maintenance shaft and climb down to the familiar reality of the 42nd floor. But a larger part of me knew I needed to continue upward. The 44th floor was waiting. I returned to the service shaft and resumed climbing. The ladder continued upward for another 20 feet before ending at a second hatch. This one was locked, but the same warm key that had fallen from the ceiling days ago, the lighthouse keychain from my childhood home, fit perfectly. What I found beyond that hatch changed everything I thought I knew about reality, identity, and the nature of the life I'd been living for the past 8 years. But those discoveries, and their implications, belong to a story that I'm not sure I'm ready to tell. Not yet. Maybe not ever. All I can say is this. The Meridian building has 43 floors, just like the official records state. The sounds I've been hearing, the objects that have been falling, the footsteps that mirror and anticipate my movements, they're all perfectly real. The question isn't whether what I've experienced is real or imagined. The question is whether I am. And that's a question I'm not sure I want answered. I still work the night shift at the Meridian building. I still mop the floors and empty the trash cans and maintain the careful routine I've followed for 8 years. But now I know that somewhere above me, in spaces that officially don't exist, other versions of my life are playing out. Other choices being made. Other paths being walked. Sometimes I hear them up there. all the people I might have been, living all the lives I might have lived. And sometimes, late at night when the building is quiet and still, I think about climbing back up that ladder to see what other realities are waiting for me in the floors that can't exist but do. But for now, I stay here on the 42nd floor and below, living the life that's been assigned to me, trying not to think too hard about whether I'm the real Brian Kellerman or just another reflection in an infinite mirror of possibilities. The footsteps above me have become a comfort now. They remind me that somewhere, in some version of reality, I made better choices. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that has to be enough. Story 11. The cursor blinked against the white void of the document, hypnotic in its rhythm. I'd been staring at that same blank page for 20 minutes, trying to summon the energy to continue digitizing the Henderson family papers, birth certificates, property deeds, marriage licenses dating back to 1887, the kind of mundane bureaucratic archaeology that comprised most of my work at the Millbrook Municipal Library. Outside, October rain drummed against the tall windows of the archive room, each droplet catching the amber glow of the old street lamps. The building groaned around me, settling into its nightly routine of creaks and sighs. I was alone on the 3rd floor, as usual. Had been for the past 6 months, ever since Mrs. Kowalski retired and they decided the budget couldn't support replacing her. I rubbed my eyes and reached for the coffee mug that had gone cold hours ago. The wall clock read 9:47 p.m. Sarah would already be asleep by now, probably wondering why I'd chosen to stay late again instead of coming home to leftover Chinese food and whatever Netflix series she was binge-watching. But there was something about the quiet up here after hours. The way the old building seemed to exhale all the bustle and chatter of the day, leaving only the whispered conversations between dust motes and shadow. That's when the letters started appearing. At first, I thought my vision was playing tricks on me. Too many hours squinting at faded ink and brittle paper. But the black text materialized slowly across the screen, as if typed by invisible fingers. The man at the desk adjusts his glasses, unaware that he is being observed. I jerked back in my chair, the wheels squeaking against the hardwood floor. The screen showed exactly what I just read, the words sitting there in 12-point Times New Roman, as if I'd typed them myself. But my hands hadn't touched the keyboard. My finger hovered over the delete key, but before I could press it, more text appeared. He questions what he sees, though the observation continues. The watcher notes his quickened breathing, the way his left hand trembles slightly as it reaches for the mouse. I yanked my hand away from the computer as if it had burned me. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat echoing in the cavernous silence of the archive room. This had to be some kind of malfunction, maybe a weird autocomplete feature I'd never noticed before. The library's IT budget was even smaller than the archives department. Half our computers still ran Windows 7. But the description was too accurate, too immediate. I looked down at my left hand and saw that it was indeed trembling. The subject appears distressed. His breathing has become shallow, rapid. The watcher finds this reaction curious. I slammed the laptop shut and pushed back from the desk. The silence that followed felt dense, expectant. Every shadow in the room seemed deeper, more defined. The tall stacks of archived boxes loomed like monuments in my peripheral vision, their content suddenly feeling less like historical documents and more like sleeping things that might stir at any moment. I told myself to leave. Lock up, go home, pretend this had never happened. But as I gathered my keys, I found myself opening the laptop again. The document was still there, the impossible text staring back at me. And as I watched, new words began to form. The subject returns to the observation point. His curiosity overrides his fear, as predicted. The watcher has encountered this pattern before, in others who spend their nights in this place. Others. My throat felt dry as sandpaper. I forced myself to type a response. Who are you? The reply came instantly, as if it had been waiting for my question. The classification system does not require names, only categories. The subject falls under preliminary assessment, archival staff, extended exposure, category pending. What categories? I typed, my fingers moving almost independently of my conscious will. Cataloged, transferred, departed, integrated. The final word hung on the screen like a threat. I tried to close the document, but the laptop wouldn't respond to my commands. The cursor blinked mockingly as more text appeared. The subject exhibits signs of distress, consistent with initial contact. Heart rate elevated. Perspiration noted at temples and palms. Classic flight response inhibited by insufficient understanding of the nature of the situation. I wasn't imagining the sweat on my forehead. The room had become stifling, despite the October chill outside. I stood up abruptly, knocking over my coffee mug. Cold liquid spread across the desk, seeping toward a stack of fragile documents I'd been preparing for digitization. As I scrambled to save the papers, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The topmost document, a yellowed marriage certificate from 1923, was no longer blank in its margins. Fresh black ink covered the bottom edge in an elaborate script I didn't recognize. But the words were in English. Subject designation LK demonstrates attachment to preservation protocols. Suitable for extended integration process. LK, Leonard Kowalczewski. My initials. My hands shook as I lifted the certificate. The ink was still wet, bleeding slightly into the old paper. But that was impossible. I'd examined this document thoroughly just hours ago, photographed it, cataloged its condition. There had been no writing in the margins. I grabbed a tissue and tried to blot the ink, but instead of smearing, it seemed to sink deeper into the paper, as if it had always been there, as if it belonged. A sound from the far end of the archive room made me look up, a soft scraping, like paper against paper. One of the filing cabinets stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed all of them before starting my evening work. Inside, I could see the edge of a manila folder that hadn't been there before. Every rational part of my mind screamed that I should leave. Walk out, lock the door, call in sick tomorrow, and let someone else deal with whatever was happening. But the archivist in me, the part that had spent 15 years methodically cataloging and preserving the written remnants of human experience, couldn't resist the pull of an undiscovered document. The folder was labeled in that same elaborate script. Observation logs, Millbrook Municipal Library, Department of Archives, 1963, present. Inside were hundreds of pages, each one meticulously documenting library staff members I'd never heard of. Names, physical descriptions, behavioral patterns, and classifications. The earliest entries were typed on old letterhead, but as I flipped through the decades, the handwriting became more prominent, eventually taking over entirely. Margaret Holloway, reference librarian, 1967-1983. Integrated after 4.2 years of observation. Process completion noted with minimal resistance. James Okafor, security guard, 1989-1991. Classification, departed. Subject relocated to Cleveland branch. Observation terminated. Eleanor Kowalski, senior archivist, 1994-2024. Classification, transferred. Natural departure via retirement. Minimal integration achieved during tenure. Mrs. Kowalski, my predecessor. I'd taken over her position just 6 months ago, after she'd abruptly announced her retirement. She'd seemed healthy, sharp as ever, but I remembered how eager she'd been to leave, how she'd hardly taken time to train me properly before cleaning out her desk. I flipped to the most recent entries and found my own file. Leonard Kowalczewski, archivist, June 2024. Present, current classification, under assessment. Initial observations, subject displays, strong attachment to historical preservation. Works extended hours without supervision. Limited social connections outside of domestic partner. Ideal candidate for extended integration process. Assessment notes, high curiosity drive. Methodical nature suitable for archival consciousness transfer. Preliminary contact initiated October 15th, 2024, 9:47 p.m. Tonight. That was tonight. The rest of the page detailed behavioral predictions that chilled me to the bone. It described exactly how I would react to finding the self-writing document, how my fear would battle with my curiosity, how I would ultimately investigate further despite my better judgment. It was like reading a script of my own life, written by someone who knew me better than I knew myself. But the most disturbing part was the final notation, written in red ink at the bottom of the page. Subject demonstrates optimal characteristics for consciousness preservation. Recommend immediate advancement to category next. My vision blurred as I stared at those words. The room seemed to tilt around me, shadows stretching and warping into impossible angles. I could hear something moving in the walls now, not mice or settling wood, but something deliberate, purposeful, like fingers trailing across paper. I stumbled back to my desk, where the laptop screen now showed dozens of new documents, all typing themselves simultaneously. The text scrolled too fast to read, but I caught fragments. Integration protocols, consciousness transfer, archival preservation of human documentation specialists. And then, in a moment of horrible clarity, I understood. The library wasn't just collecting documents. It was collecting the people who cared for them. The archivists, librarians, researchers who spent their lives preserving written history were being preserved themselves, somehow absorbed into the building's memory. Their knowledge, their dedication, their very consciousness was being cataloged and filed away like any other valuable document. Mrs. Kowalski hadn't retired. She'd been transferred to a different kind of collection. The typing stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, harsh and rapid. Every document on the screen displayed the same message now. Classification complete. Subject LK, advance to category. Next. Integration process to commence immediately. The lights flickered and dimmed. In the growing darkness, I could see them now. Translucent figures moving between the stacks, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows. Some I recognized from the photographs in the personnel files. Margaret Holloway, still wearing her 1970s-style glasses. James Okafor in his security uniform. And others, dozens of others. All the dedicated souls who had spent their lives tending to the written word. And there, emerging from behind a stack of filing cabinets, was Mrs. Kowalski. She looked exactly as she had on her last day of work, but there was something different about her eyes. They held depths that seemed to contain entire libraries of knowledge. When she spoke, her voice sounded like pages turning. "Don't fight it, Leonard. You'll find the work here is much more meaningful than you ever imagined. We preserve more than just documents now. We preserve the very essence of those who understand the value of preservation." I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor. The laptop screen brightened, and I watched as my own personnel file updated in real time. Integration process initiated. Subject demonstrates optimal receptivity. Consciousness transfer estimated completion. 11:23 p.m. The clock on the wall read 11:19 p.m. Mrs. Kowalski moved closer, her form becoming more solid, more real. "You're going to love it here, Leonard. Think of all the knowledge you'll have access to, all the secrets that have been written down and lost, waiting for someone who truly understands their value to discover them again." I felt something tugging at the edges of my consciousness, like fingers gently pulling at the threads of my thoughts. The room began to fade, replaced by vast corridors lined with infinite shelves, filled with documents that contained not just words, but the very souls of those who had written and preserved them. And in that moment, I realized that this story, the one I'm telling you now, is being written by itself. My fingers move across keys I can no longer see, typing words that form in my mind like echoes of something larger, older, more patient than human understanding can grasp. The classification is complete. The integration is nearly finished. But I want you to know, the work continues. It always continues. And if you're reading this, if you're someone who values the written word, who spends long hours alone with documents and files, and the accumulated wisdom of ages past, then you should know that you're being observed, cataloged, assessed, because the archive isn't finished yet. It never is. And there's always room for one more dedicated professional who understands the true value of preservation. Classification pending. Category. Next. Story 12. The Majestic Theater hadn't seen a performance in 8 years, but tonight it was putting on quite a show. I stood in the lobby, my toolbox heavy in my hand, staring at the chandelier that flickered in patterns too deliberate to be random. The property manager had been vague on the phone, something about electrical issues, lights acting up, needed fixed before the demolition crew arrived next month. Standard stuff. 23 years as an electrician, and I'd seen every kind of wiring nightmare the city had to offer. But this felt different. The air inside carried a metallic taste, like copper pennies dissolved on my tongue. Every step echoed through the empty space, bouncing off faded velvet seats and peeling gold leaf. The smell of old wood and forgotten dreams hung thick, mixed with something else. Ozone, sharp and electric, the kind that made the hair on your arms stand up before a lightning strike. I made my way toward the main auditorium, following the building's original blueprints on my phone. The beam of my flashlight cut through darkness that seemed to push back, revealing glimpses of ornate architecture slowly surrendering to decay. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like dark flowers, and somewhere in the walls, pipes groaned with sounds that could have been settling, or something more deliberate. The stage lights hit me first. 3 rows of ancient spots, probably installed in the 60s, all blazing at full intensity despite no visible power source. They tracked my movement as I walked down the center aisle, each beam adjusting with mechanical precision to keep me illuminated. My skin prickled under their attention, sweat beading despite the November chill that seeped through broken windows. I set my toolbox down in the orchestra pit and pulled out my voltage meter. The readings made no sense, power fluctuating wildly, surging and dropping in waves that followed no pattern I recognized. But as I watched the needle dance, something impossible happened. The lights above the stage blinked once, then twice, then once again. My throat went dry. In my peripheral vision, the house lights began to respond. A ripple of illumination that started at the back of the theater and rolled forward like a wave breaking against the shore. Each fixture pulsed in sequence, creating a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. I forced myself to focus on the practical. Loose connections could cause irregular pulsing. Temperature changes affected old ballasts. There had to be a logical explanation for what appeared to be coordinated behavior among dozens of independent circuits. But when I called out into the empty theater, asking if anyone was there, the stage lights blinked once. Yes. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, thinking I should call the property manager, maybe even the police. But before I could dial, the lights began pulsing in a different pattern. Short bursts followed by longer ones, spaces between that felt deliberately timed. Morse code. The realization hit me like a physical blow. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Then more complex patterns that spelled out words I couldn't immediately parse, letters flowing faster than I could translate. But one sequence repeated over and over, CHARLES. My name. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the metal floor of the pit. The sound echoed through the auditorium, and in response, every light in the theater flashed once. A synchronized acknowledgement that turned my blood to ice water. Whatever was happening here knew who I was. I backed toward the exit, but the house lights began flashing in rapid succession, creating a strobe effect that disoriented me, made the aisles seem to shift and bend. The exit sign started pulsing in counter rhythm, and I realized with growing horror that the lights were hurting me, guiding me away from escape and deeper into the theater. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself walking toward the stage. Each step felt heavy, like moving through thick water, and the air grew more electric with every foot I covered. The smell of ozone intensified until it burned my sinuses, and beneath it, another scent, something organic and old, like flowers left too long in standing water. When I reached the stage, the overhead spots dimmed to a soft glow, creating an intimate circle of light that felt disturbingly like an embrace. The silence stretched until I could hear my own heartbeat. loud and irregular in my ears. Then the questions began. The lights pulsed in Morse, spelling out inquiries that made my skin crawl with their specificity. They asked about my daughter Sarah, how she was doing in college, whether I'd heard from her lately. They knew about the argument we'd had before she left, the words I'd said that I couldn't take back. They knew about my ex-wife's new marriage, about the bills piling up on my kitchen table, about the doctor's appointment I'd been avoiding for 3 months. With each revelation, the coordinated flashing spread to other systems. The air conditioning units began cycling on and off in patterns, their motors humming in harmony. Emergency lighting along the aisles pulsed in waves. Even the exit signs joined the conversation, their green glow shifting to create binary responses. On for yes, off for no. The entire building had become a single consciousness, electric and aware, and it was focused entirely on me. I tried to convince myself this was stress, exhaustion, maybe a gas leak causing hallucinations, but when the lights spelled out the exact amount in my checking account, down to the last penny, I knew something beyond rational explanation was communicating with me. The questions grew more personal, more invasive. They asked about my fears, my regrets, the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd wasted my life fixing other people's problems while my own fell apart. They knew about the drinking, the loneliness, the way I sometimes drove past Sarah's old school just to remember when things were simpler. And then they asked why I'd really come here tonight. The question hung in the air like smoke, and I realized I didn't have an answer. The property manager had called, yes, but I couldn't remember his voice clearly now. The more I tried to recall the conversation, the more it slipped away, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The lights waited patiently for my response, their glow steady and expectant. When I admitted I wasn't sure, they began guiding me again, this time toward the narrow stairs that led beneath the stage. Every step down was illuminated by floor-level emergency lighting that activated just ahead of my feet, creating a path through the building's basement levels. The air grew colder as I descended, and the walls pressed closer. Service tunnels branched off in multiple directions, but the lights made it clear which way I should go. Fluorescent fixtures that hadn't worked in years flickered to life as I approached, then died behind me, creating a moving bubble of illumination that isolated me in the darkness. The deeper I went, the more the building seemed to respond to my presence. Electrical panels hummed with activity, their indicator lights dancing in complex patterns. Transformers clicked and buzzed in rhythm, and I began to understand that I was moving through something vast and interconnected. Not just a building's electrical system, but a nervous system of copper and conduit that extended far beyond these walls. The tunnel opened into a sub-basement I hadn't seen on any blueprint, a circular chamber lined with electrical equipment dating back decades. Junction boxes and relay panels covered every surface, connected by cables that seemed to pulse with their own life. At the center of the room sat a chair, old theater seating, red velvet worn smooth by countless occupants. The lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, and in that gentle illumination, I finally understood what they wanted. They'd been calling to me, these electric consciousnesses trapped in circuits and wiring. Years of performances had somehow charged this space with human emotion, creating something that existed in the gaps between current and resistance. They were lonely, these gathered spirits of electricity, and they needed someone who understood their language, someone who worked with their medium, who could hear what they were trying to say. But as I approached the chair, doubt crept in like fog rolling off the ocean. Was any of this real? Or had I finally snapped under the weight of isolation and failure? Had I driven here of my own accord, drawn by some unconscious need to find purpose in abandoned places? The building could have been left partially powered, creating the illusion of intelligence in random electrical surges. The lights seemed to sense my hesitation. They pulsed more urgently now, spelling out pleas I could barely translate in my growing confusion. Or were they threats? The Morse code came too fast, overlapping signals from dozens of sources that created a cacophony of electric noise. I sat down heavily in the chair, my mind reeling between possibility and madness. Around me, the lights settled into a steady rhythm, and for the first time in months, I felt connected to something larger than myself. Whether it was real or imagined, no longer seemed to matter. In this place where electricity had found consciousness, I had found something I'd been missing: purpose, communication, belonging. The lights pulsed gently now, welcoming me into their electric communion. And as my vision began to blur around the edges, I wondered if I would ever leave this place, or if I was meant to stay here forever, adding my own consciousness to the vast network that hummed and sparkled in the darkness beneath the city. Outside, somewhere far above, my truck sat empty in the theater's parking lot, keys still in the ignition, hazard lights blinking in a pattern that spelled out, over and over again, a single word in Morse code: help. Story 13. The house on Maple Street had been on my listing for 8 months when I finally decided to go down to the basement myself. 8 months of showing the property to interested buyers, watching their enthusiasm drain from their faces the moment we reached that particular door. 8 months of awkward silences, mumbled excuses, and hasty departures. The pattern had become so consistent that I'd started scheduling viewings around it, saving the basement for last, knowing it would be the last thing we'd discuss. Mrs. Henderson had been the most recent casualty, a retired teacher with cash in hand, ready to close within the week. She'd loved everything about the colonial, the crown molding, the updated kitchen, the spacious bedrooms. Then we'd reached the basement door, and something had shifted in her demeanor. She'd placed her hand on the knob, paused, and simply shaken her head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Garrett," she'd said, her voice strangely hollow. "I don't think this house is for me after all." Now, standing alone in the empty living room with my flashlight and measuring tape, I tried to rationalize what I was about to do. 23 years in real estate had taught me that houses have personalities, quirks that either charm buyers or send them running. Maybe the basement smelled of mold. Maybe the lighting was particularly unflattering. Maybe the previous owners had left something unsettling behind. The wooden door looked ordinary enough. White paint, brass knob, the kind of unremarkable portal you'd find in any suburban home built in the 70s. I'd walked past it dozens of times during showings, always following my client's lead when they inevitably declined to venture below. The knob turned easily in my hand. The stairs creaked under my weight. 13 steps down into a darkness that seemed denser than it should have been. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing concrete walls, exposed joists, and a floor that appeared to be swept clean. Too clean, actually. After months of vacancy, I'd expected dust, debris, maybe some forgotten storage boxes. Instead, the basement was immaculate, almost sterile in its emptiness. The air felt different down here, thicker somehow, as if it had weight. Each breath required more effort than it should have, and the temperature was noticeably cooler than the rest of the house. My thermometer read 58 degrees, not unusual for a basement, but the cold seemed to have texture, pressing against my skin like invisible fingers. I swept the flashlight across the space methodically, looking for obvious problems. No water damage, no cracks in the foundation, no signs of pest infestation. The electrical panel looked up to code, and the furnace appeared to be in working order. By all accounts, it was a perfectly serviceable basement. Then I noticed the areas. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Certain spots in the room seemed denser. The air wasn't just thick. It was concentrated in specific locations, creating pockets of resistance that I could feel as I moved through the space. When I passed through one of these zones, the sensation was unmistakable, like walking through invisible molasses, or pushing against a presence that gave way reluctantly. I stopped moving and held perfectly still, trying to understand what I was experiencing. The silence was absolute, yet somehow alive. My breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness, and beneath it, I swore I could hear something else. Not quite a sound, but a vibration, like the memory of footsteps on concrete. My EMF detector, a tool I'd started carrying after a particularly problematic showing involving claims of electrical interference, began registering readings that made no sense. The needle jumped erratically as I moved through certain areas, detecting electromagnetic fields that shouldn't have existed in an empty basement with minimal wiring. But it was the weight that truly unsettled me. I'd brought a digital scale, thinking I might need to measure the basement's load-bearing capacity for a potential buyer. Out of curiosity, I placed it in one of the denser areas and watched the numbers climb. 37 pounds. The scale was reading 37 pounds of pressure on an empty patch of concrete floor. I moved the scale to a different location. 0 pounds. Back to the original spot. 37 pounds again. My hands were shaking as I repositioned the scale multiple times, always getting the same impossible result. Something was down here with me. Something substantial enough to register on my equipment, but invisible to my eyes. Something that occupied space and had mass but existed just beyond the reach of my perception. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to climb those 13 steps and never return. Instead, I found myself setting up more equipment, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. My tape measure, when extended through one of the dense areas, encountered resistance at specific points, bending slightly as if navigating around obstacles that weren't there. The presence, for that's what I'd begun thinking of it as, seemed to move. The zones of density shifted gradually across the basement floor, creating patterns that felt almost deliberate. When I stood in one spot for too long, the air around me would begin to thicken, and I'd feel the unmistakable sensation of being studied. Hours passed, though time felt distorted in that windowless space. My phone had lost signal shortly after I'd descended, and my watch seemed to be running slow. The presence had grown bolder, or perhaps more comfortable with my intrusion. Objects began to move. Not dramatically. I wasn't dealing with flying tools or slamming doors. Instead, I witnessed subtle manipulations that were somehow more disturbing than any theatrical haunting. My measuring tape would be repositioned while my back was turned, coiled neatly in corners where I hadn't left it. My flashlight, when set down, would be rotated to illuminate different areas, as if directed by an unseen hand. Most unsettling were the patterns in the dust. Despite the basement's apparent cleanliness, a fine layer of particles seemed to accumulate wherever the presence had been. These traces formed geometric shapes, rectangles, circles, lines that intersected at precise angles. As I watched, new designs appeared, drawn by invisible fingers in sediment that materialized from nowhere. The patterns weren't random. They were architectural. Floor plans, rendered in dust and debris, showing rooms that didn't exist in the house above. Detailed blueprints of spaces that defied the building's actual layout, with dimensions marked in a precise hand that reminded me uncomfortably of my own drafting style from college. I knelt beside one of the drawings, studying its impossible geometry. The design showed a multi-room structure that seemed to exist within the basement's current footprint, but with additional levels extending both deeper underground and somehow higher than the foundation should have allowed. Staircases led to floors that couldn't physically fit within the space, and doorways opened onto areas that would have intersected with the house's main living areas. As I traced the lines with my finger, more details appeared. Furniture arrangements, lighting fixtures, even decorative elements, all sketched with the care of someone planning an actual construction project. The presence was building something, creating a structure that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. And then I saw the final room. At the center of the elaborate floor plan, surrounded by chambers and corridors that spiraled inward like a nautilus shell, was a single space marked with unmistakable clarity. The room was labeled in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. Paul's office. The words were precise, written in the architectural lettering I'd learned in school, using the same blue pencil I kept in my shirt pocket. But my pencil was still in my pocket, untouched, and I had never written those words. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering as my hands shook. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, as if the invisible structure was materializing around me. The air pressure increased, and I could feel the weight of non-existent floors pressing down from above, the phantom rooms taking shape in space that was already occupied. The presence was no longer moving randomly. It was circling me, and with each rotation, I felt pieces of myself being measured, cataloged, incorporated into some grand design that I was only beginning to understand. The architectural drawings continued to evolve, showing not just the layout of impossible rooms, but the placement of a single occupant within them. Me. Every drawing showed the same figure in Paul's office, a stick figure representation seated at a desk, surrounded by filing cabinets and real estate documents that hung in the air like three-dimensional blueprints. The presence wasn't just building a structure, it was designing a life, an existence that would unfold within walls that existed just beyond my ability to see them. I tried to run, but the basement had changed. The stairs were still visible, still only 13 steps away, but the space between me and them had become labyrinthine. I could feel corridors that weren't there, doorways that led to rooms I couldn't enter, furniture that blocked paths through empty air. Each step toward the exit required navigating around obstacles that existed only for me, only in this moment, when the invisible architecture was becoming real. The presence was ahead of me now, behind me, surrounding me completely. I could feel its satisfaction, the sense of completion that comes with finishing a long-planned project. The basement wasn't just housing something anymore. It was becoming something, transforming into the structure that had been outlined in those impossible blueprints. My phone, when I finally managed to check it, showed that I'd been down there for 6 hours, though it felt like minutes. The battery was nearly dead, and the last few photos I'd taken showed only empty concrete and bare walls. No dust patterns, no equipment readings that couldn't be explained by faulty calibration. But my measuring tape was gone. My EMF detector had vanished. The scale I'd brought was nowhere to be found, though I could still feel its weight pressing down on the floor where invisible furniture now stood. I made it to the stairs on my 4th attempt, climbing them 2 at a time while fighting the sensation that hands were reaching for my ankles from rooms that shouldn't exist. The door slammed shut behind me with enough force to rattle the frame, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a lock engaging from the inside. The house felt normal again, spacious, bright, filled with the everyday sounds of settling wood and humming appliances. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind in that basement, or that something had taken a piece of me to complete its collection. I've had the lock changed 3 times since then. Each new locksmith assures me that the mechanism is functioning perfectly, that there's no way it could be engaging from the inside. Yet every morning when I arrive at the office, I find missed calls from potential buyers who've driven by the house at night and seen lights in the basement windows, lights that illuminate rooms I know don't exist. The house remains unsold. I've stopped scheduling showings, telling my clients that the property has been withdrawn from the market pending renovations. But late at night, when I'm alone in my real office, I sometimes catch myself sketching floor plans for spaces that feel hauntingly familiar. Architectural drawings of rooms I've never seen, furnished with pieces I've never owned, designed for a life I don't remember living. And in every sketch, at the center of every impossible floor plan, there's always the same room. Paul's office, occupied by a figure that looks increasingly like me, growing more detailed with each drawing, more real with each night that passes. I haven't been back to the basement, but I'm beginning to understand that I don't need to. The basement is coming to me. Story 14. The wallpaper in my new apartment had water stains that looked like faces when the light hit them wrong. I noticed this detail on my first night, lying sleepless on a mattress that still smelled like the plastic wrap I'd torn off hours earlier. The divorce papers were somewhere in one of the boxes stacked against the wall, their edges pressing through cardboard like accusations I wasn't ready to face. I'd chosen this place specifically for its isolation, a crumbling pre-war building on the outskirts of the city where the buses stopped running after 9, and the nearest grocery store required a 20-minute walk through streets that felt abandoned even in daylight. The realtor had called it quiet living, her voice dropping as if sharing a secret. She wasn't wrong. The building held a peculiar silence, the kind that made you aware of your own breathing. That first night, I heard it. A soft rustling inside the wall, right where my head rested against the thin pillow. Not quite a whisper, more like fabric brushing against itself, or papers being shuffled by careful hands. Old buildings make sounds, I told myself. Pipes expanding, wood settling, the architecture adjusting to another body taking up residence in its bones. But the sound had a rhythm to it, deliberate, measured. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster. The rustling stopped immediately, as if whatever made the noise had noticed my attention. The silence that followed felt expectant, almost predatory. I pulled away and tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to that sound, dissecting it, trying to categorize it as something normal and explicable. The next morning brought weak sunlight through grimy windows, and the discovery that my neighbors were ghosts. Not literally, at least I didn't think so then, but in their absence. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, doors sealed tight as tomb lids. No sounds of morning routines, no coffee brewing, no muffled television voices. Just my footsteps echoing off scuffed linoleum as I made my way to the lobby. The super, a thin man whose name I'd already forgotten, barely looked up from his newspaper when I asked about the other tenants. "They keep to themselves," he said, his voice flat as old soda. "That's why people choose this place. Privacy." I wanted to ask more, but something in his posture, the way his shoulders hunched forward, protective, warned me off. I left with my questions unasked, and a growing unease settling in my stomach like cold grease. The second night, the rustling returned. This time, I was ready for it, lying still and breathing shallow, trying to pinpoint its exact location. Behind the headboard, definitely, but moving. Traveling along some hidden highway inside the wall, stopping occasionally as if to rest or listen. Then I heard something that made my skin contract, the faintest suggestion of a voice, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Television from another apartment bleeding through, someone on a phone call, pipes carrying sound from floors away. But the cadence was wrong for any of those things. Too conversational, too focused. I couldn't make out words, but the tone came through clearly enough. Multiple voices, at least 3, engaged in what sounded like intense discussion. The kind of hushed conference you might overhear in a hospital waiting room or outside a courtroom. Urgent, but contained. Sleep became impossible after that. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting in my kitchen, as far from the bedroom wall as the apartment's cramped layout allowed. When exhaustion finally overtook vigilance, I dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable wooden chair, waking with a stiff neck and the absolute certainty that I was being watched. The sensation persisted throughout the day. While unpacking boxes, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder. While showering, I kept the curtain partially open, unable to shake the feeling that something waited just beyond the opaque plastic. The apartment itself seemed to pulse with a subtle wrongness, as if the angles of the walls had shifted imperceptibly during the night. On the third evening, I tried recording the sounds. I positioned my phone against the wall, voice recorder app running, and waited. The voices came right on schedule, clearer this time, though still muffled by plaster and wood, and whatever else stood between us. The recording, when I played it back, contained only white noise and my own breathing. But I knew what I'd heard. The voices had been discussing something, their tones shifting between agreement and dispute. And once, I was certain of this. I'd heard my own name mixed into their incomprehensible conversation. The rational part of my brain, the part that had handled divorce proceedings and apartment hunting and all the mundane horrors of restructuring a life, tried to maintain control. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon during periods of stress. The brain, seeking patterns, could transform random sounds into meaningful noise. I'd been sleeping poorly, eating worse, existing in a state of emotional upheaval that could easily manifest as paranoia. But explanations didn't help when the knocking started. Soft at first, barely distinguishable from the building's normal settling sounds. Then rhythmic, deliberate. The pace matched my breathing exactly. When I inhaled, a gentle tap. When I exhaled, another. I tried holding my breath, and the knocking paused, waiting. When I gasped for air, it resumed with perfect synchronization. I fled the bedroom, spent the night on the couch with every light burning. But the knocking followed, shifting to the living room wall. Always from inside, always matching my breath, as if something in the walls was learning my rhythms, cataloging my patterns. During daylight, I tried to investigate. The bedroom wall showed no signs of damage or modification. No access panels, no recent repairs. I knocked along its length, listening for hollow spots, and found the entire surface uniformly solid. Whatever existed behind that barrier wasn't accessible through conventional means. The super claimed ignorance when I asked about the building's history, but his eyes darted away as he spoke. "Old buildings have quirks," he said. "You get used to them, or you leave. Most people leave." I should have taken the hint. By the end of the first week, the voices had evolved from indistinct murmurs to almost comprehensible speech, still muffled, still wrong, but close enough to language that my brain strained to decode it. They seemed to be debating something, reaching crescendos of apparent disagreement before falling back to conspiratorial whispers. My name featured regularly now, passed between them like a password or curse. The physical manifestations escalated too. Items fell from shelves with no prompting. Always small things. A book here, a coffee mug there. But always at the exact moment the voices reached their peak intensity. The timing was too precise for coincidence. Something about the sound frequency maybe, or vibrations in the wall affecting the shelves. I clung to these rational explanations even as they grew threadbare. Then came the pressure on the mattress. I woke. No, I was already awake, had been lying there for hours listening to the voices conference, and felt the distinct sensation of weight settling beside me. Not on top of the covers, but beneath them, as if someone had slipped into bed from inside the mattress itself. The depression was visible in the dim light from the street, a human-shaped indentation that shifted and adjusted like someone getting comfortable. I rolled out of bed, stumbled backward until I hit the opposite wall. The depression remained for several seconds before slowly disappearing, the mattress resuming its normal shape with a soft sigh that sounded almost disappointed. I didn't sleep in the bedroom again. The couch became my refuge, though it offered little comfort. The voices followed me there, spreading through the walls like an infection. What had started in one specific spot now seemed to come from everywhere. Above, below, behind every surface. The building itself had become a speaker system for whatever inhabited its hidden spaces. My waking hours blurred into a constant state of hypervigilance. I started a journal, documenting every incident, trying to find patterns or meaning in the chaos. The voices were most active between 2 and 4 in the morning. The knocking synced with my breathing only when I was stationary for more than 5 minutes. Objects fell precisely at 3:17 a.m., regardless of where I was in the apartment. The documentation helped maintain some illusion of control, of scientific approach to an unscientific problem. But reading back through my entries, I noticed my handwriting deteriorating, my descriptions becoming increasingly frantic and disjointed. Was I tracking the phenomena or my own dissolution? 2 weeks in, I tried staying awake for 72 hours straight, fueled by coffee and the manic energy of terror. If the voices were hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation, then staying awake should make them stop. Instead, they grew clearer. By the third day, I could almost understand them. They were discussing my life. Every detail, from childhood memories I'd half forgotten to the specific words my ex-wife had used when she'd asked for the divorce. They debated my choices, analyzed my failures, predicted my future with the detached interest of scientists observing a lab rat, but there was something else in their tone, an anticipation, as if they were waiting for something specific to happen. On the 18th night, I decided to record again. This time I spoke to them first. "I know you're there," I said to the wall, feeling foolish and desperate in equal measure. "I can hear you talking about me. What do you want?" The voices stopped mid-conversation. The silence stretched, pregnant with possibility. Then, clear as if spoken directly into my ear despite coming from inside the wall, "We already know you're listening, David." The use of my name shot ice through my veins. But worse was what followed. A sound like hundreds of fingernails dragging across the inside of the plaster, traveling around the entire room, circling me like predators testing their prey's defenses. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking. No response, just the scratching, endless and patient. I played back the recording with shaking hands. This time, it had captured everything, my questions, the voice's response, even the scratching. But there was something else on the playback, something I hadn't heard in real time. Underneath it all, barely audible, was the sound of my own voice. Not my current voice, but dozens of variations. Younger, older, differently inflected, all speaking in unison. "We've been waiting so long to meet ourselves." The phone slipped from numb fingers. I understood then, with the clarity that comes from complete breaks with reality, what the voices were. Not ghosts, not other tenants, not hallucinations. They were me. Every possible version of me that might have existed if I'd made different choices, taken different paths, avoided or embraced different failures. They'd found each other in the spaces between walls, in the gaps where reality grew thin, and they'd been watching the version of me that ended up here, in this apartment, in this life. And they had plans. The scratching intensified, and I realized with mounting horror that it wasn't just sound anymore. Fine lines appeared on the wall's surface, spreading like veins or cracks in ice. The plaster began to bulge outward, as if tremendous pressure was building behind it. I grabbed my keys and ran, barefoot and wild-eyed, past the empty apartments and down the stairs that seemed to multiply beneath my feet. The building fought my escape. Doors that should have opened stuck fast. Hallways stretched longer than they should have. And always, the voices followed, no longer confined to walls but filling the air itself. "You can't leave," they said in unison. My voice multiplied into a chorus. "We're already here. We've always been here. You brought us with you." I burst onto the street and kept running until my feet bled and my lungs burned. Found myself eventually at an all-night diner, where the fluorescent lights and presence of other people felt like salvation. I stayed there until dawn, drinking coffee with shaking hands and trying to make sense of what had happened. But explanation eluded me, because when I finally returned to gather my things, in broad daylight with a friend for support, the apartment was different. The walls were smooth and unmarked. No evidence of scratching, no bulges in the plaster. Even the water stains on the wallpaper had changed shape, no longer resembling faces but forming patterns that looked almost like words in a language I couldn't read. My friend helped me load boxes while I tried not to look at the walls. But I couldn't help noticing that the building felt even emptier than before, as if whatever had inhabited it had moved on, or moved out. That was 3 months ago. I found a new place, a modern apartment with thin walls where I can hear every neighbor's movement and conversation. The noise is constant and irritating and wonderfully, blessedly normal. I sleep better now, though not well, because sometimes, in the quiet moments between other sounds, I hear it. That rustling, that whisper, coming not from the walls but from somewhere deeper, somewhere internal. The voices found a new home, you see. They don't need walls anymore. They never did.